it's the damp cold of the Magdalen laundries creeping into our bones, or the sundered silence of mother and baby homes being broken, or the glimpses of what was an all too acceptable culture exposed by the Kerry babies case. All of these things are connected by the way we as a country have treated women, and particularly the way we have treated pregnant women. I think of another cold January like this one in 1984, when the 15-year-old Anne Lovett gave birth alone to her son beneath a statue of Our Lady. The death of Anne and her baby son in these stark and lonely circumstances is a memory that chills this country still, and one which we must not forget. We now arrive at another moment on a long journey, starting with the insertion of the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution in 1983. Through the court cases that made us think about the pregnant victims of rape and incest, through the bravery of families faced with fatal fetal abnormalities, who made us think about the particular cruelties we have added to their tragedies. And after all of this, perhaps arriving at the realization that each crisis pregnancy is different, and each involves a real woman facing a very difficult and very personal decision. Real women like the 36 from County Carlow who travelled to the UK for an abortion in 2016, or the 38 from Mayo, or the 69 women from Tipperary, the 85 women from my own county of Wicklow, the 241 from Cork, or the 1,175 from Dublin. Women from every county in the Republic of Ireland travelled to the United Kingdom in 2016 to access an abortion. And I think we need to acknowledge them all. 49 from Kerry, 130 from Kildare, 21 from Leitrim, 20 from Roscommon, 69 women from Wexford, 39 from Cavan, 15 from Monaghan, 99 from Limerick, 53 from Clare, 38 from Westmeath, 63 from Donegal, 113 women from Galway, 44 more women from Kilkenny, 42 from Laois, 83 from Louth, 100 from Meath, 28 from Offaly, 29 from Sligo, 16 from Longford, and 56 from Waterford. In 2016, at least 3,265 Irish women travelled to the UK alone, and we also know that Irish women travel to other countries like the Netherlands as well. Over 1,200 of the women who went to the UK were aged between 30 and 39. Over 1,500 were aged between 20 and 29. 255 were aged 40 or over. 10 were girls under the age of 16. 230 were teenagers. Over half of the women who travelled were married in a civil partnership or in a relationship. 85% of the women were between 3 and 12 weeks pregnant. It is estimated, Caherlock, that at least 170,000 Irish women from all over this country have travelled to other countries for abortions since 1980. And these are not faceless women. It might be convenient for us sometimes to think they are. They're not. They're our friends. They're our neighbours, our sisters, our cousins, our mothers, our aunts, our wives. Each woman is dealing with her own personal situation and is making what is a deeply difficult decision. Because this time around, let's be honest about this. This is not a decision or a procedure that anyone takes lightly. Women agonise about it. Women consider every possibility for dealing with the particular crisis that faces them. And sometimes they arrive at the conclusion that there is no other option for them but to terminate their pregnancy. And when they arrive at that difficult decision, the country we live in, the country we hope has come a long way from the dark events that continue to haunt this chamber, we tell them to go and get their care elsewhere. Go to another country, head off somewhere else. In 1992, we formalised the right of Irish women to travel for an abortion. We formalised the right for them to obtain information about it. But we've been temporarily exporting women in crisis for an awful lot longer than that. And I can't help but wonder, what would we have done if we didn't have a neighbouring island to help us turn a blind eye? And sometimes, yes, turning a blind eye is the same as turning your back. We need now to seek to build a society which accepts our own challenges, our own realities, and addresses them honestly, maturely, and openly. One which does not seek to deny the reality or to outsource it to another country. One which does not reject women at the most vulnerable moments in their lives. As I stand before this House today at the commencement of what I genuinely believe in time could be seen as a historic debate, I am fully aware of the sensitivities and the complexities of this issue. I want to acknowledge the deeply held, genuine views on all sides of this House and throughout our country. No matter what may divide us, I accept that all of us, are trying to do what is right. All of us are guided by our own conscience, our own sense of humanity. And some of us have changed our views over the years. My own views have changed and have been formed by listening to women, listening to doctors, and coming to recognise some hard realities. Some of us bear the scars of past debates, and some of us fear what is to come. But this time, I firmly believe it is possible for us to have a respectful debate on this issue. And please do not call that naive. Don't dismiss the idea that we can maturely recognise that each of us does have deeply personal and genuinely held views, all of which deserve to be heard, to be understood, and to be respected. It is an issue that troubles most of us as individuals, let's be honest. For some of us, it challenges us to hold what appear to be conflicting views simultaneously. Which of us doesn't value and love human life? And which of us doesn't want to see that protected? No one has a monopoly on that. Name-calling, pigeonholing, stereotyping, these tactics need to be consigned to history because they've only led to paralysis, fear, and division in our country. And this is going to require an effort and attention from all of us, regardless of your view. But it is so important that everyone has a chance to hear clearly, so that when as a nation we come to make the next decision on this issue, we make an informed one as a people. And we do so as a country with a particularly complex past, which in fact dates right the way back to 1861, when abortion was a felony under the Offences Against the Persons Act, a felony with a sentence of penal servitude for life. In more recent decades, it's been an issue dominated by referendums and court cases. 1983, as you all know, saw the first referendum. In 1992, there were another with 3 questions. Legislation followed in 1995. A third referendum on abortion was held in 2002, seeking to overturn the X case but was defeated. And in 2014, the issue came before this House again, when we passed the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act. I remember vividly that debate, and I remember some of the offensive comments about floodgates opening. And I remember the language that was used that seemed to suggest that women would even fake a threat to their own lives to obtain a termination. Quite unbelievable, really, when we look back only those few short years. None of this has obviously come to pass, and the reports laid before this House each and every year bear that out. Since the passing of that law, there has been a clear legal basis for abortion in Ireland, but it has been clear that this Oireachtas can go no further without constitutional change. Other members have tried to bring forward legislation, thoughtful legislation, to assist families with the diagnosis of fatal fetal abnormality, for example. I've been the minister to respond to these private member bills, but on each occasion it has been very clear, and the legal advice has been clear, that without the repeal of the 8th Amendment, we as an Oireachtas could not address these issues. So, Cathaoirleach, abortion is a reality for women living in Ireland, but not just the women in the limited circumstances in which it's legal under the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, nor for the many women who travel to other countries, which I've already outlined. There are now also new realities on top of that. The Oireachtas Committee heard evidence of abortion pills, now being bought on the internet and used by women in this country without any medical supervision. Research from the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology shows a 62% increase in the number of women from Ireland contacting one online provider alone over a 5-year period, from 548 women in 2010 to 1,438 in 2015. And that's just one provider. And can we just pause and picture what this is telling us, because we can get lost in numbers and years. Is it acceptable to any of us that women are once again left in a lonely and scary place, sending off for a pill, to be sent through the post instead of being able to access medical advice and support that they need. This is happening in Ireland today. This is a fact. How can we ignore it? How can we consider it to be all right? It is the sad reality that we have been exporting this issue for many decades. But are we now accepting that on top of exporting, women must import their own solutions? I want to turn now to the substance of the recommendations of the Joint Committee on the Eighth Amendment, and I want to start by commending all the members for their work and thank them for the contributions they made. They have served this Oireachtas well. I wish to thank Senator Catherine Noone in particular for her calm and balanced handling of the issue as chair. We as an Oireachtas asked these colleagues on a cross-party basis to do a very important body of work, to listen to experts, to hear the evidence, and to report back to us. We owe them a debt of gratitude for the time and dedication they applied to their task. And I'd also like to commend the Chair of the Citizens' Assembly, Ms Justice Mary Laffoy, and the members of that Assembly for their careful deliberations and to acknowledge their very valuable contribution. The Citizens' Assembly and the Committee have given us a model for addressing this issue in a rational and measured way, and I believe it's one we should follow. I want to recognise that the recommendations contained in the Committee's report represent the views of the majority of members, but there was not unanimous agreement on them. I respect the views of those who dissent from the recommendations, but I do believe those recommendations are the basis on which we must proceed on this issue. The main conclusion of the Committee's work is that change is needed to extend the grounds for lawful termination of pregnancy in this state, and in order to effect that change, the Committee recommended that Article 43(3) should be removed from the Constitution. The Committee then went on to make recommendations on the grounds on which termination of pregnancy should be permitted in Ireland if Article 43(3) is repealed by the Irish people. They recommended extending the law on abortion to cover cases where the health of a woman is concerned, cases of fatal fetal abnormalities, and a broader legal regime that allows abortion where the woman seeks it from her medical practitioner if her pregnancy is under 12 weeks gestation. I'm working with my Chief Medical Officer and officials in my department and the Attorney-General to consider how best to translate these recommendations into legislation, should that be the wish of the Irish people. It is my intention that in the event of a referendum, as much information as possible would be available to people so they can make an informed decision. Whilst it's understandable that the focus so far has been on the Committee's recommendations regarding the Eighth Amendment, I think it's very important to say and put on the record of this House that the Committee didn't only make recommendations on termination of pregnancy, but also on the services and supports that should be available to women. I'm fully committed to ensuring that all women accessing maternity services in our country should receive the same standard of safe, high-quality care. Every woman from every corner of Ireland should expect and be able to access the maternity services she needs. I am confident that through the implementation of our first ever, and in some ways it's incredible it's our first ever, national maternity strategy called Creating a Better Future Together, the quality outcomes envisaged by the Committee will be realised. Officials in my department, under the chairmanship of the Chief Medical Officer, have now established a group to address and formulate an effective and comprehensive response to the issues raised by the Committee in their ancillary recommendations. We have made other progress, which provides the base for delivering the kind of integrated care women and their babies deserve. We've established the National Women and Infants Health Programme. We now have HICWA standards for safer, better maternity services and new HSE national standards for bereavement care to ensure clinical and counselling services are in place to support all women and families in all pregnancy loss situations. The HSE's Positive Options Crisis Pregnancy Counselling Service is also available in 50 centres nationwide. Cahirlach, as someone born 3 years after the 1983 referendum on the Eighth Amendment, I never imagined I might one day be the Minister for Health responsible for a referendum on its repeal. I come at it from a perspective that I think was sadly absent in 1983, and that is from the perspective of women's healthcare. In the ministry I have the honour to hold, it is my duty to work to ensure that people in this country receive the highest possible standards of care and to protect and promote the health of our people under the laws of our land. I realise this issue before us challenges us. It challenges me. It causes us to ask difficult questions of ourselves. It makes us uncomfortable at times as we collectively wrestle with what is at its core a very personal and private matter. Women become pregnant and it's a joyous thing for so many. But it is a terrifying thing for some, and it is a tragic thing for others. Irish women are driven today to find their own solutions. Sometimes they put themselves at risk in doing so. And as things stand, they are often left without help, without advice, without support, at one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. I hope, I really do, that as a country, we can no longer tolerate a law which denies care and understanding to women who are our friends, our sisters, our mothers, our daughters, our wives. Ultimately, there is always a deeply personal story behind each individual case, which I believe is a matter best served by women and their doctors. I believe the people in this country trust women, and I believe the people in this country trust their doctors to make these difficult decisions. I do look forward to what I hope will be a constructive debate on the issues raised by the committee here and also in Shannon. I hope we can show here that this debate can take place in an atmosphere of respect for each other's views, so that the same is possible in the context of a referendum campaign. After this debate concludes, I expect to return to government in the coming weeks with a series of proposals which I believe can deliver a referendum by the end of May or by very early June, should the will of this Oireachtas be to facilitate that. I do not doubt that as long as I remain as a member of this House, I will continue to witness moments in this chamber that will remind us of the darker times in our history. But let this be a different type of moment. Let this be a moment people will look back on as one where their representatives confronted one of the most complex issues we have faced as a country, with clarity, with compassion and with care.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Deputy Billy Kelleher.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Look, just to say at the outset, I again welcome the opportunity to speak on this very divisive issue that has been at the heart of debate and discourse since 1983 in the context of the Constitution and the insertion of Article 43.3. I too was too young to vote in that particular campaign, Minister, but a few years older than you, may I say, so I was only 3 years short of being able to vote in 1983. But it does indicate that there is a huge swathe of people out there who never have had an opportunity to cast an opinion on this particular issue. And bear in mind, it is primarily women of childbearing age who are most affected by it, who have never had an opportunity to actually cast a view on this particular issue. Since I was appointed spokesperson for health for Fianna Fáil, this is an issue that I have been grappling with. We had the debate in the context of protection of life during pregnancy, bill that subsequently became the Act. I sat in the committee that formulated that particular debate that was chaired by Jerry Buttimer at the time. And it was very insightful because it was the first time that as an Oireachtas we sat down and tried to deal with it in a non-political way, recognising that this is socially divisive and people have very strong feelings. After that, we then moved to a situation where my leader, Micheál Martin, allowed us a free vote, a vote of conscience, and other parties have followed, and others have not. And that is entirely their entitlement. And I don't believe that it is for me to say they should or should not. Because what I've tried to do since I was appointed spokesperson for health for Fianna Fáil was to take the political element out of this particular issue, because it has been charged for a very long time and has been used from time to time by political parties of all persuasions and none as well. But I believe we've gone beyond that in terms of society being mature enough to have a very respectful, incisive and decisive debate on this particular issue, and that it will be ultimately the Irish people that will decide. Now, I also sat on the Joint Oireachtas Committee, and I want to first and foremost pay tribute to the Citizens' Assembly, chaired by Justice Mary Lafoy, who did outline the workings of the Citizens' Assembly and the reasons and how they came to their conclusions and the recommendations they made. We were then charged by this Oireachtas, as a committee, to look at those Citizens' Assembly's recommendations and come to our own determinations. Now, there was no majority view or no unanimous view on the committee, but there was majority views and there was dissenting views and varying views even within that context. And I respect every one of those particular views. And I think if we are to allow the Irish people to have the space to grapple with this particular issue equally inside in this chamber, we have to acknowledge that people have very deeply held views, morally, ethically, and even religiously. They are views that are held, and they are deeply held. But at the same time, my personal or political discomfort is nothing compared to the discomfort that is caused to women every day of the week, grappling with a crisis pregnancy or an unwanted pregnancy, or the devastating news of a fatal fetal abnormality. So we have to be conscious of that. The Minister outlined that 170,000 women plus have left this state for a termination. 170,000 people. We have been exporting our problem for a very long time. And it's our duty, I believe, to address this particular issue. And we can only do so with the best will in the world, and people have varying views on this. We cannot do anything other than what we've legislated for already, unless we repeal Article 43.3, or amend or replace. But we have to change what is presently in our Constitution. And I believe that that is the first step to addressing this particular issue. It would be easy for me and for others that are speaking on this issue to keep our head down and just hope that it goes away. But we have to, as a generation of politicians, deal with this issue. And we have to give the Irish people an opportunity to express their view in view of the fact that the last time they had an opportunity was in 1983. And Ireland has fundamentally changed. It has changed in many respects, as outlined by the Minister. But where it has changed most is that women have become more assertive. And they have an opportunity now in this particular debate to put themselves at the heart of this debate. Because this is primarily about women's rights. It's primarily about women's health care. It's about primarily giving women equal opportunity in this republic. And we cannot have a situation where when a woman becomes pregnant, she becomes a second-class citizen. And we have to accept that that is a situation that's no longer acceptable in this republic. Now, the recommendations that were made by the committee, people have asked me, how did we arrive at those particular recommendations? Well, the Citizens' Assembly sat and it made 13 recommendations, the most fundamental one being that there should be a change to Article 43.3, and it outlined 3 options. The committee's recommendation from a majority point of view was that it should be a repeal simpliciter. In other words, it should be just taken out of the Constitution and allow for the houses of the Oireachtas to legislate for what is primarily a healthcare issue for women. But, of course, there are varying views on that in terms of the legal advice that the committee was given and sought, and I'm quite sure there will be different advice, possibly even given to the government by the Attorney-General. But the one thing I do know is that if we continue to allow Article 43.3 to be the bulwark in terms of how we deal with this issue, well then the status quo will prevail. And every night, 4 or 5 women will take self-administered abortion pills at home. And every day, 10 women will get on planes and fly abroad. And that will be something that we will have to live with as Parliament if we fail to grasp this particular issue. And I think we have to show political leadership in the context of having a debate, respectful of every view that will be expressed inside in this chamber, and then allow the Irish people with the full information to make their decision and to make their determination. And I would urge everybody involved to, as I said, not only respect, but to engage in the debate, so that when it is decided, that it is decided one way or the other. Now, I have, as I said, expressed my view that it must be a repeal simpliciter or a variation of that, but it has to take Article 43.3 out of the Constitution. Whether it is the Oireachtas that has the supreme authority to legislate on this issue, and if that article is put into the Constitution, I am open to those observations, and I would take advice both from the Attorney-General's opinion and others as well. But what we must ensure, and must be honest with the people, that if Article 43.3 is replaced or repealed, it is the legislator will govern from there on. And we can't guarantee anything, and I think we have to be honest with the Irish people. We can publish legislation in advance of this campaign, in advance of this referendum, to give them a guidance as to what would be the likely outcome. But let's be very clear, if it is the Oireachtas that legislates from now on, if there is a repeal, well then it is the Oireachtas that will decide, and not necessarily this one. It could be another one or another change after the general election. But all we can do is to be honest with the people that in terms of the makeup of this particular Oireachtas, what we believe we would pass if there was a repeal. And I strongly urge that people would look at the recommendations of the Oireachtas Committee and why we came to those determinations. And we primarily came to determinations which are very much more conservative than the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. The Citizens' Assembly spoke at length in the context of gestational periods of 22 weeks. We are primarily saying that it should be 12 weeks in the majority of cases, but in the context of the health and the life of the woman, well, that would be a matter for the clinicians and the woman themselves. Some areas that have been spoken about by lots of people saying that they want to address the issue of fatal fetal abnormality. And I had a friend whose wife was diagnosed or got the diagnosis of a fatal fetal abnormality. They wanted to have this child. And they kicked the sand up and down Garryvoe Beach for weeks and weeks on end because of the diagnosis that they were given, wondering what they would do. Would she continue with the pregnancy, or would she go to have the pregnancy terminated? And for weeks and weeks they were deciding that issue. The only difficulty, of course, was in the event of they deciding that they were going to terminate the pregnancy, which was not going to survive outside of the womb, they would have to go abroad. And then they made the decision to go abroad. But the point is, it was just inhumane that our country could force that on our citizens, that they would actually have to make a decision to terminate a pregnancy because they felt they could not go through with this because the diagnosis and prognosis was certain death ex utero. And the idea that we would actually ask those people to FedEx their little baby back home to Ireland, in my view, is inhumane. And for that reason, I think the recommendations highlighted in the report are ones that are critically important in this debate. The issue of rape and incest is also something that a lot of people speak about. People who have, quite conservative views in this particular area, but they do say that, well, look, incest and rape should be addressed. All the evidence we got and the empirical legal evidence we got shows that it would be impossible for us to legislate for rape. So we have to trust the integrity and honesty of our women. Are we to put people who have already been subject to a vile act through another inquisition to find out and determine whether or not they have been raped in advance of having a termination? Because if we are putting restrictions on these issues, these are the things that will actually have to happen. And that's why, in the context of the recommendations of the committee, we also looked at the 12 weeks, and that it would be a matter between the clinicians and the woman in determining the reasons for a termination within the 12-week period. And that would also address the issue of incest and rape in the vast majority of cases. And we wouldn't, as I say, need to have an inquisition of women to establish whether or not they were actually telling the truth. I firmly believe we should trust our women in this context. And I believe that we have a duty to ensure that they have the space with their clinicians to make the best decisions for themselves and the lives that they are living. Now, the Minister spoke as well about the age profile of women travelling abroad. And I've received several emails from people, which I find quite alarming, to say the least, that we have people thinking like that out in society, where effectively they're saying that the women that go abroad are just using it as another form of contraception. Now, I find that grossly offensive. I don't know any woman that gets lightly on a plane and heads to Liverpool or Birmingham or to Holland to have a termination of a pregnancy. I don't know any woman. And I do know women who've had terminations. And they've grappled with that before they made the final decision. So the idea that, it is just another form of contraception is, in my view, a grotesque, offensive view of women in this country. Now, as I said, our party allowed a free vote, so I speak here in a personal capacity. I speak here as Billy Keller, a Fianna Fáil TD, but in a personal capacity and representing the people of Cork North Central. And I said my personal views and my political views are left outside that door when I speak on those particular issues. Because, as I said, having listened to the evidence in the committee and having experienced what people had to endure, both listening to their testimony at the committee and speaking with people individually as a TD when they brought the challenges that they had to face when they got devastating news of a fetal abnormality, or sometimes a fetal abnormality, and the decisions that they had to make. But I do believe that this particular debate will give, or the space should be given to the people. And I think that if we are to have and expect the Irish people to behave in a manner that allows respect for varying views, well, the very least we should do is expect it from each other inside here as well. And if we are to lead by example in any way, it should be in that particular issue of allowing for the space and varying views to be expressed. The committee itself did, as I say, have varying views on it, but there was majority views expressed in a number of areas. The Citizens' Assembly did say that real and substantial physical risk to the life of the woman. Reason 2, real and substantial risk to the life of the woman by suicide. Serious risk to the physical health of the woman. Reason 4, serious risk to the mental health of the woman. Serious risk to the health of the woman was number 5. Number 6, risk to the physical health of the woman. Number 7, risk to the mental health of the woman. Number 8, risk to the health of the woman. And then 9, pregnancy as a result of rape. And we concurred as a committee with those recommendations by the Citizens' Assembly, by and large. We concurred with them. We did deviate from some of them, primarily in the area of disability. We were very clear that disability should not be a grounds for termination. And again, you know, let's be honest, people make decisions and make choices. And are we to adjudicate and judge and be judgmental on the decisions that they make? Are we really to say to a person who's got the most devastating news that the baby they're carrying has profound disability or will die ex utero, that we should be so judgmental, that we should be so judgmental? But our committee did say, at the end of the day, that after 12 weeks, in terms of disability, there wouldn't be grounds for a legal termination in this country. Because it was a view that a lot of members felt strongly, even those that had quite open views on this particular issue. So it wasn't the case of just the committee being a slave to the Citizens' Assembly. It did deliberate on every one of those recommendations and came to its own conclusions. And we did diverge in certain areas on this particular issue. So, members of the House, I hope fervently that the government can keep to its time frame. And I say that in the hope that we can have this issue dealt with in the substantive issue of the repeal of Article 43.3 by the summer. Whether we have schemes of the bill published is a question that obviously will require a lot of resourcing. But I do believe we have to be honest when we're talking about legislation and people having concerns about 12 weeks and fetal anomalies as opposed to fetal incest and rape, that nothing can be done unless we actually remove Article 43.3. So all the talk about what might or could happen is only in the event of Article 43.3 being removed. And the only people that can remove that are the Irish people. And inside here, I have the same vote as any person outside there. It will be the citizens themselves. So our duty is, first and foremost, in my view, to facilitate the referendum, to establish the Commission to observe that it's fair and impartial, and for political parties or individuals to ensure that at the very least it is honest and upfront, whatever view they hold. and that we are respectful of each other. But as a person who will be 50 next Saturday, I certainly don't want, personally, to preside over the continuation of what is presently here, knowing that next year and the year after and the year after, we will have thousands of Irish girls and women boarding planes to seek health care in other countries, or climbing a stairs in their bedroom with an abortion pill because this state has failed them. Thank you.
Now we go to Sinn Féin and Jack Jerry Adams, who I understand is sharing with Deputy Mary.
Yeah, by Murlu Glock, Jack Bomacha, last concur goes to my week, as in Jay Slorcher and Aber Fear Topic Talk Shaw, a top we Brad, Nadala Tranona. I'm also grateful to the Joint Committee on the 8th Amendment. I commend our members, in particular the Chair, Senator Noon, and the 3 Sinn Féin representatives, Louise O'Reilly, Jonathan O'Brien and Paul Govan. And I also want to thank the Citizens' Assembly and their Chair, Justice Mary Lafoy. And I want to commend the Health Minister for his very compassionate remarks and the thoughtful remarks also of Choctaw Billy Kelleher. 100 years ago, Concordia, this year, Countess Markovich was elected to the first Dáil and went on to become the first female cabinet minister in Europe. And she was part of a revolutionary strand of the national movement that included women like Hannah Sheehy Scappington, Kathleen Lynn and Elizabeth O'Farrell. These were fine women who serve as role models for many of us to this day. And they led the struggle for women's rights in extraordinary times, buoyed by the Freedom Charter that was the 1916 proclamation, which addressed itself equally to Irish men and Irish women. They must have felt betrayed after the counter-revolutionary period, which resulted in the development of 2 conservative, narrow-minded states in our country that championed public policy that was anti-women, chauvinistic, cruel and intolerant. Women were written out of history. In this state, their status was confirmed in the 1937 Constitution as the women's place being in the home. For women who strayed beyond so-called norms, they were sent to Magdalen laundries or to mother and baby homes. And there they endured unbelievable hardship and were denied everything by a state that condemned them for no reason other than the fact that they were women. And such attitudes permeated every facet of Irish life. The architecture of the state ensured that women were consigned to a lesser status. The employment marriage bar remained in place until 1973. Domestic violence was not even recognised as an issue, and it wasn't until 1976 that a woman could seek a barring order against her husband. Criminal conversation, which enshrined in law that the wife was the property of her husband, remained on the statute books until 1981. Contraception wasn't available without prescription until 1985, and even then only in chemists until 1991. And even the simplest things, the purchase of a television or a radio on hire purchase, was not possible without a husband's signature. And while strides have been made in addressing some of the historic injustices forced on women by this state, the legacy of that treatment remains with us today. On issues like pay equality, or the lack of it, the scarcity of women from many aspects of public life, politics or leadership positions in commerce, academia and other sectors. And that injustice is evident also in the continued prevalence of the 1983 amendment to an already out-of-touch constitution, which prohibited access to what was, even at that time, in any developed society, basic medical treatment. And that last Concordia is not right. It is wrong, and it is our responsibility as legislators to end that injustice. The business of the state should be to ensure that women have access to proper health care services should they need them, and should they choose to avail of them. The state has a responsibility to support women. We should not fool ourselves Abortion is a reality in Ireland. Abortion pills are available here but can be ordered online and taken by women without medical supervision. Or women in distress can go to England, an English solution to an Irish problem. I have my own position on abortion, but as a legislator, I have no right to impose that view on anyone. It's not for any of us here to cast judgment on anybody doing what they feel they need to do. It's for women to make that judgment. And I, for one, believe they're fully capable of doing so, and they're entitled to do so. Those who are opposed to abortion are entitled to their opinion, and they're equally fully entitled not to have a termination. Everyone has the right to choose. Those who prescribe to a particular faith, for example, can heed the guidance of their religious leaders if they so choose. But it's not for anyone to voice their views on anyone else. And that's my strongly held opinion. Some will oppose that analysis. Some who will do so are friends of mine. And they're good people with sincerely held views, and I respect that. So tolerance has to be the hallmark of our discourse. But Ireland has changed. That change has been spearheaded by women in the first case. And Manrana Huron are not going to accept the continued guidance, Maria, of a constitution written when women were second-class citizens, revised in 1983 under false pretences, as dogma. Women don't need moral diktat. They certainly don't need condemnation. What they need and deserve is respect. What they need is the right to make decisions about their own health and their own lives. Repealing the 8th Amendment is the right thing to do. It will correct a historic wrong. I hope that a referendum to afford the people the right to this happens as soon as possible, and I hope that the people will support that proposition. We can debate the merits or otherwise of what legislation will come after that. For Sinn Féin's part, and this has been a long-standing policy for quite a long time, we accept the availability of abortion where a woman's life, health or mental health is at serious risk or in danger, or in cases of rape or sexual abuse. And recently we went back to Unheard to deal with the issue of fetal abnormality, because I, for one, never knew there was such a condition. And we listened to compassionate people standing up explaining how their partner, or they themselves, or their sister, or one of their friends decided to carry a fetal abnormality to full term, while others couldn't do that. So we changed our position accordingly. And I think that's what we have to do. The first step, therefore, is to allow the women the right to make a choice on these deeply distressing matters. It is their business, it is their right, it is their choice. So Sinn Féin will fully support the repeal of the 8th Amendment. Gura míle mágat, Las Concordia.
Dr. MacDonald, who has 12 minutes.
Gura mágat, Las Concordia. And can I add my voice to those who have already commended the work of the Committee on the 8th Amendment. And I want to particularly commend my own colleagues, Teachta Dáil, Louise O'Reilly, Jonathan O'Brien and Shanador Paul Gavin, and indeed the Cathaoirleach Senator Catherine Noone, who did a very fine job. I think as an Oireachtas we made a big ask of our peers, of our colleagues on that committee, and I think they conducted themselves with great dignity, with great compassion, and I think with great intelligence and thoughtfulness, and I want to commend them for that. I was disappointed that some tried unsuccessfully to thwart the work of that committee, and I say that not to sound a note of rancour, but simply because I think some of the disrespectful commentary that featured in the course of the committee's work must not be the kind of rhetoric that sets the tone for the public debate. So, as we begin now what I believe will be, and I hope will be, a historic and momentous journey for all of us, as we move to repeal the 8th Amendment from the Constitution and agree a new legislative and regulatory framework, I hope that all of that work can be done in an atmosphere that is respectful, well-informed, calm and fair. Over the last 24 hours, the harrowing experiences of Joanne Hayes and all the horrific events that surrounded what became known as the Kerry babies scandal over 30 years ago have played themselves out again in harrowing and heartbreaking detail. The scale of the abuse that Joanne endured at the hands of the state was unprecedented and horribly and agonisingly public. I want to welcome yesterday's apology on the part of Unheard and indeed by An Taoiseach. This is most welcome, and I believe that An Taoiseach will now move to make good his statement today on compensation for Joanne Hayes. She is entitled to a full and formal apology by the state for its persecution and vilification of her and her family, and she is also deserving of compensation and redress. Back then, the Garda Síochána not only failed Joanne, but having pursued her case in the most, it seems, corrupted of manners, they then went in very viciously for a second bite at the Tribunal of Inquiry. I remember the name Joanne Hayes as a girl, and I remember the Kerry babies spoken of. I also recall the incredible atmosphere of hostility directed at women and girls in 1983. I remember and can still feel the very toxic atmosphere within which the Eighth Amendment was conceived, debated and inserted into the Constitution, and I believe there isn't a woman across this land of my age who still can't feel how that atmosphere felt. This was, after all, the Ireland of the mother and baby homes and the Magdalen laundries, an Ireland in which women were to be subjugated, kept inside the home, to be kept quiet and accept their fate. And the obsessive control of women didn't happen by accident. It was a very much intended matter by a powerful conservative cohort across Irish society, in government, in the churches and across the highest ranks of the public and civil service and, let it be said, professional elites. Women's subjugation was part of a carving up of power and influence in the public and private spheres. It did not happen by accident. As Emily O'Reilly, then journalist and now European Ombudsman, wrote in 1992, and I wish to quote her, the widespread passive acceptance of the patriarchal nature of Irish society also enables the conservative lobby to hold sway. Nothing threatens the system more than when women are enabled to take control of every aspect of their lives, public and private. And there is nothing more critical to the exercise of that control than the ability to decide how many children to have, if any, and when to have them. The Eighth Amendment was, I believe, in effect, a constitutional coup. The reactionary codification of the suppression of women. In my view, that is what happened in 1983. And for decades after, since, women in Ireland have had to live with all the abusive outworkings of the Eighth Amendment. The X case in particular brought into sharp focus the worst expression of the Conservative coup. A child, pregnant as a result of rape, dragged through the courts by a state whose sole and stated intent was to force this child to continue a pregnancy from rape to full term. And I still, in all honesty, struggle to fully comprehend the callousness of our state, a state that would so aggressively, so cruelly force a child victim of rape to continue with pregnancy. It's hard to fathom that anybody or any agency could heap more abuse and trauma on a child who had already been violated. And even after the Supreme Court judgment, the public outcry and the horrors endured by Miss X and her family, Successive governments refused to legislate for the X case for more than 2 decades. I think it's important to record the shame that is, the shame on successive Oireachtas. It took the tragic death of Savita Halappanavar and the alphabetical array of cases taken by incredibly brave women to shame government finally into enacting the X case Supreme Court decision into legislation 2 decades later. There is now, I believe, a broad acceptance, not just across the Oireachtas, but I believe in wider society, that the 8th Amendment must be repealed from our Constitution. And I passionately believe that now is the time for leadership in that regard. And I too wish to commend Minister Harris for his words here today. Leadership has to come from the front. Abortion is a divisive issue. That statement echoes throughout this debate. And perhaps it is. But let me tell you, the abuse of women and indifference to our health and to our bodily integrity is not just a divisive issue, it is now an unacceptable position in Irish public life. Some people say because abortion is a divisive issue that votes of conscience must therefore be allowed. I have to say that I don't share that view or position, and I say that as somebody who is deeply respectful of diverse views and who understands absolutely that some people will struggle with this issue. However, and it must be said, in the final analysis, this debate is actually a matter of public health, of women's health, and of our rights to decide, a respect for our conscience as we decide on matters for ourselves. The clinicians, the doctors, not least at committee, have made absolutely clear that the 8th Amendment casts a long shadow over their practice and their relationship with their patients. They have made it very, very clear that the 8th Amendment jeopardises women's health and women's lives. The first question, Las Ceann Comhairle, for this Oireachtas is the nature of the question to be put on repeal. A simple repeal of the 8th Amendment from the Constitution, as recommended by the committee, must be delivered on, and there can be no equivocation on this by anybody. If legal advice is offered up that takes a contrary view, for instance, if instead of repeal simpliciter there is a suggestion of an enabling clause within the Constitution, well then we need that legal advice, and I would suggest to Government that that advice should be shared with other members of the Oireachtas, because above all we need transparency and a well-informed debate. And I absolutely agree with Deputy Kelleher and my colleague Deputy Adams when they say that the first order of business is repeal of the 8th. And then, yes, of course, we must debate and we must have an understanding of the legislative framework thereafter. But the first task, and I believe the first duty of the Oireachtas in this time is to remove the 8th Amendment from our Constitution. It's now the time to right a fundamental wrong that occurred in 1983. And as legislators, we cannot accept the terrible impact of the 8th on women's health, their obstetric care and well-being, and their and our fundamental rights. We must state out loud and clear that we trust women, we respect women, and that there is no place for the cruelty of the 8th Amendment in a modern and diverse Ireland. Neither can there be place for unnecessary dogma or doctrinaire positions in the coming months. I accept that we must listen to people's concerns and acknowledge those concerns and engage with them. It is, after all, our shared responsibility to protect women's rights and their health now and into the future by engaging in a respectful debate and delivering a successful referendum result. That means repeal of the 8th. Last count, Corla, when this amendment was made to the Constitution, I was 14. We're all being confessional and owning up to our ages. I was 14. And as I was reflecting on this debate as we embark on it and listening to Joanne Hayes, I was wondering how I would explain to my own 14-year-old daughter now what Ireland was like then, what that hostility felt like for women and for girls, girl children. And I'm very happy to say that I couldn't begin to explain to my 14-year-old daughter what that's like. And that's a great thing. And I believe it's now time for the law, for politics, and for every member of this Oireachtas to catch up with Irish public opinion, to catch up with the new Ireland, the Ireland that my 14-year-old daughter lives in, and all of our daughters and granddaughters and our boy children and men live in, and give us and them a decent, human rights-based, respectful constitution that acknowledges us as women as full and equal people.
And Brendan Harlan.
Guramagat Lascan Corla, and I too am happy to make a contribution to this truly important debate, and I think perhaps historic debate. I do so as leader of the Labour Party, but I think, and we'd all confess, I do so as the first speaker in this debate who actually was a member of the House of the Oireachtas in 1983. Not in this House. I was a newly appointed member of the other House. And I was present on Wednesday, the 4th of May 1983, when then Senator Mary Robinson moved an amendment on behalf of the Labour group in Shannon Éireann. That amendment said that Dáil Éireann refuses to give a second reading to the 8th Amendment to the Constitution Bill on the grounds that the bill is so unclear and ambiguous that it is not a proper subject for a proposal to be submitted to the people in a referendum. That was the unanimous view of Labour senators, of which I was one. The Taoiseach at the time, Garrett Fitzgerald, described the Constitutional Amendment Bill as dangerous and unacceptable. At the same time, he urged Fine Gael senators to abstain on the Labour Party amendment. The amendment in Shannon Éireann to refuse the passage of the 8th Amendment Bill was lost by 18 votes to 15 votes, with Fine Gael senators abstaining and all Fianna Fáil senators opposing the Labour amendment. At the time, there were 3 Northern Irish members of the Seanad, all who supported the Labour Party position. I believed then, as I do now, that the Constitution is not the place to determine our laws on abortion. Others have said that Ireland has changed radically over the past 35 years, and so it has. The issue of abortion has throughout this period been divisive and challenging. Unlike any other issue of social policy, it has not been those most directly affected that have been involved in the debate. Not the women. Tens of thousands of women, 170,000 we've heard, at least since 1980, who for the most part have been silent and unseen, who availed of abortion services outside this state. Their voice, their experience has gone largely unheard, unable often to discuss their choices or their health needs with friends, relatives, or even their medical practitioners. Instead, by and large, the debate 35 years ago and since, has been led by individuals and groups who come to the issue with moral certainty and with crusading zeal. In that context, I wish to commend the work undertaken with care and with openness by both the Citizens' Assembly and the All-Party Oireachtas Committee. And like others, I want in particular to commend the work of the chair of the committee, Senator Catherine Noone. The report of the committee is clear and it is thorough. The committee addressed two fundamental issues. Firstly, it examined the requirement or not for constitutional reform. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution was passed on the 7th of September 1983, after what the report characterised as a bitterly contested referendum. I believe that characterisation is accurate, indeed understated. I remember it. I was going to include some of my memories of that time, but I thought that would only contribute actually to further divisiveness, so I won't. But the experience of that campaign has impacted on all political discussion of this issue that has happened subsequently. I welcome the change in atmosphere so far, and I say so far, judging from some emails and letters already been received. I doubt if that will continue. The recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly was to replace Article 43.3 with a provision that explicitly authorises the Oireachtas to legislate to address termination of pregnancy, any rights of the unborn and any rights of pregnant women. I strongly agree with the view taken by the Oireachtas Committee regarding the effect this proposal would have on the separation of powers. The recommended approach of the committee to simply repeal Article 43.3 is, I believe, a better and a safer course of action. On this first and fundamental issue, then, that the Constitution is not the appropriate place to deal with an issue as complicated as abortion, impacting as it does on evolving medical practice and technology, is, I believe, widely supported. In many ways, therefore, it is not what will replace Article 43.3 by way of legislative provision in the event that the Oireachtas was free to legislate in this matter that has been the greater focus of the Oireachtas Committee. The first issue must be to allow the Oireachtas to make those decisions and to remove Article 43 from the Constitution. I believe that whatever proposals that we determine, and I want to deal with them in some detail, will obviously evolve over time in any event. Many have argued before 1983 and since that a constitutional provision is required because the Oireachtas or even the judiciary cannot be trusted on this issue. The original objective was to tie the hands of elected TDs and senators to prevent change in our abortion laws, regardless of changes in medical practice, knowledge or understanding, drugs and general access to drugs. The constitutional provision of 35 years ago remains unaltered. In all the experiences of the past 3 decades, it is surely now time for change. The Oireachtas must be given the scope to address these critical issues in an evolving world. The members of the Citizens' Assembly and of the Oireachtas Committee showed how these matters can be addressed calmly and thoroughly, having regard to the complexity surrounding both abortion and maternal health. They provided proof, if proof were needed, that the Oireachtas can be trusted and, equally importantly, should be trusted to act in the best interests of all the people. So, the legislation that should be enacted in the event of Article 43.3 being deleted from the Constitution was, of course, a significant focus of the committee. 13 recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly in relation to the grounds on which termination of pregnancy might be lawful were considered in turn. The committee also examined the operation of the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act that we enacted in 2013. In general terms, I think it's fair to say that the Oireachtas Committee did not recommend change as far-reaching as that recommended by the Citizens' Assembly, a point made by Deputy Kelleher. Most clearly in relation to the Citizen Assembly's recommendation that abortion should be lawful up to 22 weeks gestation on socio-economic grounds. That was not supported by the Oireachtas Committee, who recommended instead that the law should be amended to permit termination of pregnancy with no restriction as to reason, provided that it is availed of through a GP-led service delivered in a clinical context as determined by law and licensing practice in Ireland, with a gestational limit of 12 weeks. Although this recommendation is, as I've said, much more restrictive than that proposed by the Citizens' Assembly, it is still likely to be the most controversial of the committee's recommendations. For that reason, I believe it deserves most careful consideration and an examination of the reasoning that brought the majority of the committee members to this conclusion. In truth, to fully understand the development of thought, it is necessary to have listened to or read the submissions and presentations to the committee. The report itself condenses this really important vital work into a few short paragraphs, but it is clear from the work of the committee itself that when you move from general declarations of principle to actual practical law, that their recommendations make sense. How can we achieve the objective to allow for abortion in the case of rape or incest in any other way? It cannot be that we need a police investigation and a court prosecution to have concluded before determining that an abortion can be lawful. God protect us from going down that route again. To attempt to legislate for rape or incest on a standalone basis would open a nightmare world for already traumatised women. It would involve Gardaí and lawyers when what is needed is medical and psychological support. The reopening of the appalling circumstances surrounding the Kerry babies case should be stark evidence enough of that. Our laws have to be practical, enforceable and humane. The committee's recommendation in this regard, as I've said, is, I believe, therefore, the correct one. That view is immeasurably strengthened by the fact of life now that there is broad availability of abortion pills. Unless it is the intention of the Oireachtas to arrest and prosecute every woman who imports or takes these pills, we need to face that reality. Well, I've no doubt there will be some who would advocate for such arrests or prosecutions. I have no doubt that such action would be repudiated by the vast majority of our people, not to mention the implication for women's rights in international law. So when the matter is carefully examined, it is clear how and why the committee came to the recommendation it made. Another area where the Oireachtas Committee differed from the Citizens' Assembly was in relation to allowing for abortions in the case of fetal abnormality that is not likely to result in death before or shortly after birth, up to 22 weeks gestation. That's the Citizens' Assembly recommendation. The committee's view, with which I agree, was not to accept that recommendation. The committee recommended that provisions in the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act 2013 needed to be amended. That act, as I think the Minister has already referenced, was drafted under the constraints of Article 43(3) of the Constitution. And it is clearly a fact that many of us, including members such as myself who were in government at the time when the Act was enacted, will be very happy indeed to see that Act amended in the event of constitutional change allowing us to do that. There is much more in the report, dealing with sex education, obstetric care and counselling and contraception. It's a very important and a welcome body of work. It's now time for the rest of us in the Oireachtas, having given this task to our colleagues, onerous task and all as it was, to do our bit. Those of us who are not members of the committee. We need to address, without delay, the steps to be taken to allow the people to have their say before the end of May. Now, the talk of slipping into June is not acceptable. We've already had volumes of correspondence today from young people who will be out of the country in June, finish their studies, and students who are starting their Leaving Cert on the 6th of June. It would be perverse if the very people going to be most affected by this would be excluded from having their say for the first time on a truly important issue. We need to address the steps to be taken, therefore, to allow this to happen by the end of May. And the Taoiseach set out the path before us when he was asked today. The Minister for Health is to bring memoranda before Cabinet between now and March. We need to pass the referendum bill. We need to establish a referendum commission and to allow it adequate time to do its important work. Equally importantly, as I say, we need to have the time frame set. So, can I ask the Minister this, and others commented favourably on his speech in relation to this topic, and I thought it was a very thoughtful speech. But it was a speech that said, we need to bring about change, as opposed to a speech saying, I'm the Minister and this is what I intend to do. I've considered the report and this is what I'm recommending to colleagues. I think we need to get to that point now. We've had an enormous amount of debate, decades of debate, but concentrated debate at the Citizens' Assembly and in the Oireachtas Committee in the last year. It's now time for us to set out the timelines on how we can achieve this objective and allow the people, ultimately, to have their say. I began by reflecting back to debates in these chambers in 1983. Seared by the campaign that followed those debates, I expressed the hope that we could do things differently and more respectfully now. In the intervening years, as Minister for Health, I had my own home and office picketed. I had children's coffins brought to my Wexford office, and Wexford was posted with things that I won't mention. I hope that the past is another country, that it is possible for us all to listen as well as to speak, to acknowledge difference without vile attack. For my party, that is what I pledge. Labour accepts this report, the Oireachtas Committee report, and its recommendations. We will campaign for change with vigour but with respect. My party has been to the forefront of social change for as long as I can remember. Campaigns, some of which look amazing now, to provide for legal contraception, to allow for divorce, and most recently, to provide for marriage equality. All in their time, they were strongly resisted. All in their time, they came to pass. Often we discover that the people's thinking on social policy is more advanced than the elected members of these houses. So let the people decide this matter. Let us also work to ensure that they can do so in an atmosphere of reason, without interference from groups or elements outside this state. No doubt many groups will engage in the campaign. Some will seek to characterise it as something that it is not. What is in question here is an important matter of social policy for our people. It's not a contest of state and church or the defeat of anyone. Simply and importantly, a matter of supreme importance for thousands of our citizens as families and as individual women try to make the best possible decisions for themselves and their loved ones. After decades of fear, the people in 2015 overwhelmingly passed a constitutional amendment to allow for same-sex marriage. For many who voted yes on that occasion, that was a journey of self-discovery and tolerance. Perhaps it's not too much to hope that we can have something similar on this issue too.
I move to the check the Ruth Coppinger, who may be sharing.
I'm sharing time with Deputy Breed-Smith.
That's agreed.
I'd like to welcome people who are here for the debate, but actually there's hundreds of people outside in freezing cold temperatures listening to the debate, and they're part of the Strike for Repeal movement. Young people in this country are watching this issue like no other political issue. And this will be the biggest political, social issue in 2018 and for many, many years to come. And what the people outside are waiting to hear is the response of the Dáil to the All-Party Committee report, to the Citizens' Assembly recommendations as well, and an action plan from the government outlining exactly what will happen now and when this will be implemented. The nub of it is people want simple repeal, referendum, by late May, because that is the optimal time for the maximum participation of young people, and lest anybody be under any illusion, they're the people most affected by this decision. This Dáil is not made up of young people, obviously. It's made up of a very unrepresentative sample of society in many ways, and what they want is a referendum that will actually lead to change, to real abortion legislation. The very minimum that legislation must contain is a 12 weeks unrestricted access to abortion as a minimum. Now, if anybody thinks that repeal can be avoided, that we can put it off till the autumn, till next year, there will be a revolt among young people if that was even contemplated. But moreover, if anyone thinks that we can have a repeal referendum with very little change actually following it, that also would lead to a huge reaction. The tide can't be held back on this issue any longer. Now, I've spoken on the issue of abortion a lot. I'm tired of listening to myself, never mind what other people are tired of listening to, but this is for a reason. It's because the idea of bodily autonomy for young people is an absolute. Abortion rights are what people want, not on this ground, a deserving abortion, this or that. The concept of abortion rights is now what most young people and a growing section of the population believe in. And can I say as well that people can't just, or political parties, can't just hide behind repeal and think they can sail through the referendum, not saying what will follow it, or trying to pretend that they stand for things that they maybe don't. You can cut that out as well, because in effect, and I'm talking to the whole Dáil, in effect, this will be a referendum on abortion rights, and in a sense that's only natural, because I don't think that this Dáil has the guts, has the the composition to bring in abortion legislation without a massive public endorsement and push on it to do so. And so the concept of 12 weeks will be a key concept in the referendum. Now, Solidarity is obviously pro-choice. Solidarity People for Profit is the only fully pro-choice formation in the Dáil up until recent times. Maybe, hopefully, that will change. And we've played a lead role in obviously arguing this case and in the active movement for repeal. Solidarity recognises these are historic recommendations, and particularly when you think it's only 4 short years since the very same parties arguing for change voted in a 14-year jail sentence for women. That is an actual fact. So what has brought this change about? Now, we've heard a lot of people on the committee and others saying they were on a journey. But I think that the phrase has become very well worn. I think we need to, they've decontextualised it from the actual reality, because people may have been on a journey, but they were pushed on that journey as well, in many cases kicking and screaming, because change has been forced from outside. Obviously, the evidence that was heard at the committee was very, very important, and I played a role in arguing and advancing some of that evidence, and very importantly in the case of the abortion pills, which I think is a crucial factor in the decision being reached and has been cited by many people. In terms of civil disobedience that was taken with regard to the abortion pills, I think was also hugely important. The use of the abortion pill tripled in about 3 years since particular actions were taken by organisations like Rosa and others. So I think we need to be, honest where the change has come from. And I think we also need to be honest that this Dáil set up the Citizens' Assembly in an outsourcing fashion, and they assumed it will come back with a much more minimal recommendation. But there's always a danger when you entrust ordinary people with important decisions. They might actually listen, engage, and fact-check as well the evidence that they hear, and they might come up with essentially, compassionate and pro-choice, essentially, recommendations. The 12 weeks on request obviously came from the Citizens' Assembly, but also socio-economic reasons up to 22 weeks I want to put in the record. It wasn't unfortunately agreed by a majority of parties and groups, but it was advanced by a strong minority. And it was a bit of a cop-out, to be honest with you, because many women won't be able to fall in to a 12-week time frame for lots and lots of reasons, usually the most vulnerable, the poorest and the youngest. And all we're doing is continuing on travel outside. I think the other question I want to refer to is disability and severe abnormality. It's obviously quite clear that people who are anti-abortion are going to use very emotive arguments about disability, Down syndrome, etc. We've heard them already throughout this campaign. And it is the case that the committee didn't take a position of supporting a majority for severe abnormality. But I just want to say, we take no moral lectures from anybody about a woman who would make a decision on those grounds. People, it's not a cakewalk bringing up a child with a severe disability, and particularly parties and individuals who've done nothing to make their lives better and have voted for cuts in disability, etc. But I have to say as well, the response of a huge number of TDs has been so far to run for cover. Still, a huge number haven't declared where they stand on this. If examining their conscience was an Olympic sport, well then numbers of Irish TDs will be winning Olympic gold medals, because there was great play made after around the time of the marriage equality referendum that everyone held hands in the Dáil and walked out and won the referendum, and that is not the case. And it's not going to be the case here because parties won't be united. There isn't a party whip. And the winning of the referendum will be down to huge numbers of active people, young people, women, and communities as well. And I think for politicians who are feeling troubled, it's very simple. The two questions that you need to ask and answer are this. Number one, do you support abortion being legal or illegal? Because it will continue regardless. And number two, do you actually support forcing people to remain pregnant who don't want to be pregnant? Because that's the logic of supporting a ban on abortion. And people say, there's extreme views on both sides. I don't think I have an extreme view. My view is the person involved ultimately should make that decision. And I think that's a humane view. I just wanted to finish up by saying also that we need to give huge credit to the active campaigns like the people who are outside, because the protests have mushroomed in the last number of years. the repeal jumpers being worn, the people taking part in repeal protests, the strike for repeal, women who themselves defied the unjust ban by ordering the abortion pills online, events like the abortion pill train, bus, etc. that I mentioned. And the recommendations of the committee arise from those social movements that have taken place on the ground. A lot of people have invoked 1983-84 and the year that followed the 8th Amendment, the crass hypocrisy of Anne Lovett, of the Kerry babies, etc. There's now a growing movement for gender equality. We've seen it with Trump, we've seen it with the Me Too movement. The movement taking place outside on repeal is the exact same. It's a movement for bodily autonomy and for abortion right, and the time is up now for politicians to be hiding on this issue. There isn't any hiding place left, because young people won't accept any further procrastination or restrictions. And if, Minister, I would ask you, it hasn't been said, what is the date of the referendum? That is a key demand and question in the minds of people outside. I also think the earlier information we got from the Taoiseach that you're not going to move a repeal bill until early March is leaving it extremely tight, because you need at least 6 weeks plus the 30 days grace before the referendum can be called. Maybe you would clarify that. And just to be clear, it has to be repealed simpliciter. This was debated on the 8th Amendment Committee. I don't have time to go into it. And we need a complete scrapping that then of the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act.
Just a comment, and it struck me very much. I went out to show my solidarity to the protesters outside, but I came from where my office is in Ike House down to the Dáil. And you'd swear to God there was a revolution happening outside the gates. There's barricades that must have cost a fortune from right across the laneway that leads to the back of Dawson Street and over the other side of Kildare Street. And then there's big metal barriers outside Buswell's Hotel, and it's impossible for somebody to move in and out of it. Only that I'm a deputy, that the Gardaí recognised I wouldn't have been able to move. Why is there such paranoia about this subject and women? Why is society so terrified to allow women have a voice on an issue that has everything to do with their body? And the vast majority of people out there are ordinary young women. They were not going to storm the gates of Leinster House and come in with submachine guns and mow us all down. They're out there to plead with us. For God's sake, get on with it. This Dáil has a shameful history of dealing with this issue. I have seen it with my own eyes. Long before I came in here, I could obviously, it used to crease me to see for 21 years, after the Supreme Court ruled on the X case, for 21 solid years, there was cowardice played out in this House. No party had the guts to move on this issue until Claire Daly brought in the first bill, I think it was in April 2012. The first time anybody had the guts to say, this is an issue and we have to confront it. Now, I'm acutely aware, because there was a campaigner in 84 for the 8th Amendment, I'm acutely aware of Joanne Hayes, of the Kerry babies and all of the stats. I'm also acutely aware how young people, anybody under the age of 45, not just your daughter, Mary Lou, but anybody under the age of 45 is horrified today, having read the details of what happened to Joanne Hayes all those years ago. But we're not just talking about the darkness of the 80s. Hello, in 2017, a young woman was sectioned because she said she was suicidal and wanted to have an abortion. She was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. In 2014, we kept a clinically dead woman alive for several weeks against the wishes of her family because the fetus inside her had a heartbeat. In 2014, a raped asylum seeker was forced against her will to continue with a pregnancy. In 2012, Savita Halapanabar died having requested an abortion in the hospital with Galway. And then we have the alphabet soup of Miss X, Miss C, Miss D, you go on. And we have the condemnation by the UN Human Rights Commission that what happened to Amanda Mellett was inhumane, degrading and cruel. What does that say about this country and the political representatives who have run this country for the last decades? It says a lot, and we are indeed living in the dark ages. We don't have to think think about the Kerry babies. And I want to say to people out there, I know there are genuine people out there who do not want to see this happen again, who are ashamed of that shameful dark history, but they're worried when they hear, oh, the floodgates will open and women will want to have abortions every other day of the week because it's a great way not to get pregnant, or to get pregnant, just get rid of it, just get the pill, swallow it and end the story. I really want to say to people out there, if you do not want to see any of these incidents repeated, if you want to take obstetricians and gynecologists who came to the committee and gave evidence that the 8th Amendment creates a chill factor for the medical profession when it comes to dealing with women, they are afraid of their lives to intervene when there's a heartbeat because of that 8th Amendment. To those who are even middle of the road, please vote to get rid of it, because until you do, we are going to have a repetitions of X, Y, C's, Amanda Mellets and others. And I think that has to really go across clearly. The vast, vast majority of people in this country do not wish to see that sort of a society. Even though I think there is an extreme atmosphere around this issue, and particularly in the corridors of religion and sometimes in the corridors of power. And to those who want to stop women having bodily autonomy, I'd like to say this to them. Minister, you made a very good speech, actually. I read it. It's very good, it's very conciliatory, but there's some gaping holes in it, because you referred to the 1861 Act, which gave women, subjected them to a sentence of penal servitude for life. Life, I think, is about 7 years. We actually have an act now that subjects women to 14 years, but you forgot to mention it. You also said you want to give out as much information as possible in the course of this referendum. Can we please ensure all deputies a sense of responsibility? If you give out information, please make sure it's accurate, so that when we are told by a deputy in Fianna Fáil that there will be a floodgates opening because for abortions for Down syndrome, please give accurate information. You cannot get a test for Down syndrome prior to 12 weeks without paying out €400. And actually, the case that the subject that Ruth raised about socio-economic really comes down to this. You could always have an abortion in this country if you could afford it. You could always have an abortion. You can get on a plane, you can go away and pay for it. When you're poor, when you're asylum seeker, when you live in direct provision, or when you're a worker who cannot take the time off and who has to scrape the pennies together to pay up to £2 grand for an abortion, that is when you're actually absolutely discriminated against. And that's one good reason to remove it, to remove that discrimination on class basis and that discrimination against a cohort of women who don't have the right to enter and leave this country freely. I think we also have to have respect for doctors in the medical profession and give them the space to work with women to make the decisions about their health. And sometimes women are even subjected, because it is the only time in maternity care that you as an individual do not have a right over your own body to say what happens. Very often women, and I know many of them, who are going through miscarriages are forced to wait for 20, maybe 25 hours because the doctor is not allowed to induce them, and they have to wait in terrible pain until the miscarriage actually is seen to the end, and has left many women my age, I know of, distressed for their whole lives, and has had an impact on all of their families. The last thing I'd like to make a very strong appeal to is to those who think that by protecting the 8th Amendment, they are protecting something precious. Actually, you're not. All you're protecting is the dark, dark history of this country. You are not going to protect any unborn fetus, any unborn potential child, by protecting the 8th Amendment, because you cannot force somebody to be pregnant when they don't want to be pregnant. They will find a way out of it, and it's either, as has already been said, support legal abortion or support illegal abortion, or support the extradition and the enforced exile of women out of this country to Liverpool, to London, to Holland and elsewhere. Or indeed force young women in particular to have an abortion on their own, in their own bed, by taking the pill without any medical supervision because of the chill factor of the 14-year sentence. They're even afraid to tell their own parents. And we've had a situation in Northern Ireland where there's been 3 women charged and arrested for using or procuring the abortion pill. One was a mother who procured it for her child, and the other two were women who procured it for themselves. That also has to change. And I would hope that if we get the 8th Amendment out of the Constitution and begin to establish legal, safe abortion for women in this country, that it will cross the border, and that the Brexit factor will not stop it crossing the border, because actually they should have had it long before us under the 1968 Abortion Act in Britain. I want to say to those who think that they're protecting precious life to think about it in this way. There are children living in this country who have been born in this country. 1/5 of them live in poverty. Something like 3,000 of them are in homeless accommodation tonight. Molly, during the week, was an example of one of the hundreds of children who haven't had their rights met, and they are born. They are human flesh and they are living. We haven't endorsed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. We're continuing to force children into homeless accommodation. If you feel so passionate about life, please join us in fighting to change that, to get the rights of people with disability acknowledged, to end homelessness and to end poverty among lone parents, which is at its highest rate ever. There are many ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to protect human life. And that is what I would like to say to those who think that I'm some kind of a terrorist, and I'm sure many of you have received the literature calling us terrorists for supporting a woman's right to choose. And the right to choose, by the way, is to be able to choose to have a child as well. And how can you choose to have a child with dignity and respect if you have no access to a home, if you have no access to a proper health service, if you have no access to a job, if you have no access to free IV treatment when you're finding it difficult to get pregnant? So choice works both ways. To choose to be able to control pregnancies, to choose to be able to have a child. That's the sort of future society I think we want to live in.
Catherine Connolly. We'll take Runch to Kojama.
Hey, no, me jig. Hey, no, me jig. I'll send Chin on Chocta Pringle. First of all, I want to welcome the opportunity to participate in this debate. I want to thank the committee and the Senator, Catherine Noon, who chaired it, and all of the members, and also the members of the Citizens' Convention. I also want to thank the Minister, and I want to thank him clearly for his speech and the content of his speech and the way he's delivered that. However, I do have two reservations that have already been mentioned. One is no timeline, and the second is the failure to mention the draconian 2013 legislation. In relation to this, the repeal, the various recommendations, I fully support the recommendations of the committee. The amendment, the Constitution was amended in the 80s. The 80s that gave us the case of Sheila Hodgers, who died on the 19th of March prior to the referendum. And so we knew exactly what we were doing in this country when we passed the referendum. And she died 2 days after delivering her baby, premature. Her cancer treatment had been stopped by the hospital, which claimed it would harm her pregnancy. And she also was denied x-rays and pain relief. That was prior to the amendment. And so when we passed that amendment, we passed it in an Ireland, as mentioned, of the Kerry Baby Tribunal, or the beginning of that. We passed it in an Ireland where Anne Lovett died at the end of this month, 33 years ago, I think, on the 31st of January. It was an Ireland that sent Eileen Flynn from her position in a school in Wexford simply because she loved somebody, a man who she subsequently married, had a further child with, and raised his children. It was an 80s of the moving statues. It was the 80s of limited contraceptive. It was the 80s where marital rape wasn't recognised. It was the 80s where we had no divorce, and many, many other things were absent. But most of all for me, as somebody who lived through that time as a young woman, it was the Ireland of the secrets, the Ireland of shame, the Ireland of mass immigration, the Ireland that told us if you step out of line and do something, you will be punished severely one way or another. And those secrets and that shame came to light, and those secrets and that shame that were put by the pillars of society at the time, both in the church and out of the church. And then subsequently we saw those pillars fall to the ground. I'm not here to mention names, but one has to mention some names, as in relation to Father Clary, Bishop Casey, and the subsequent horrific exposure of abuse We had the different types of inquiries. We had the clerical abuse, Ferns, Clyne, Dublin. We had the institutional abuse, the Rhine, and we had the abuse in families exposed by numerous inquiries, including Kilkenny and Roscommon. And of course, the 80s and the abuse that happened there was in relation to the Kilkenny incest case, which was subsequently published in the 90s. So we had the 80s of secrets that followed on from previous decades of secrets and has continued, as previous speakers have said, right up today. We're grappling with the mother and baby home in Tuam. And we still haven't learned to be honest, straight and direct. We still haven't learned, and I'm glad you're nodding your head, Minister, in relation to that. I want to thank, and I've thanked you and I've thanked the committee, I want to particularly thank the women, the courageous women who have brought the inadequacy of the 8th Amendment to our attention repeatedly in the most appalling of circumstances. And the brave women, for example, the 17-year-old who refused to allow herself be classified as suicidal back in 2007, 10 years ago. And when she was being pushed to say she was suicidal, and she simply wanted a termination because she had discovered that she had an anencephalic pregnancy. And she was adamant that she wasn't suicidal, and she was forced to the High Court. And if we take the many, many cases, and I don't have time to go into them, from the 8th Amendment onwards, and it was quite clear at the time to me and to other people that this was an appalling amendment to a constitution. We knew there were going to be problems, even as a young woman. And so we go forward from that, and we go forward to the 92 case, famously known as the X case. A 14-year-old girl raped by a family friend. And she has to go through absolute torture in relation to getting a termination. And we move forward into the 97 case. A 13-year-old girl raped and became pregnant. Again, appalling circumstances and an appalling process for her to try and get a termination. And then we have the D case in 2006. Fatal fetal abnormality diagnosed. Again, and a difficult process to get termination. I've mentioned the 17-year-old Miss D case in 2007. In 2010, we have the ABC case and Miss C suffering from cancer, pregnant and cancer. And we go forward to 2012, and in my own city, Savita's case. And again, absolutely appalling lack of basic treatment. But the fact that they were putting more emphasis on a fetal heartbeat than on the treatment of obvious sepsis that shouldn't have happened. And then we go forward to 2016, and we have the Wheeling case. And in 2017, Wheeling was 17, and 16 was, I just temporarily forgotten, the Amanda Mellett. And so, over that period of time, we have been forced by very brave women, women whose health have suffered, women who have died. We have been forced by European Court judgments. We have been forced by United Nations Committee, who have clearly told us that what we are doing to our women is inhuman, degrading, and amounts to a certain torture. I'm here tonight to proudly add my voice to say the amendment has to go. It simply has to go. It is time to trust women to make decisions. I make my comments in the context of a 100-year celebration of when women got the right to vote, a limited right, I might add, and in the context 70 years after, in this Dáil, when Noel Browne bravely tried to bring in his mother and child comprehensive scheme for mothers and children. And that wasn't successful. And 70 years later, we have a report, a very welcome report from the Oireachtas Committee with its ancillary recommendations telling us that in the 21st century, in 2018, we simply have significant gaps in our maternity services. Significant gaps in so many areas in the provision of our maternity services. And you, Minister, have clarified that this is the first maternal strategy. And so we are excluding women from our health service in the 21st century, 70 years after Noel Browne's gallant attempt. They're excluded from the health service in terms of getting a termination, and they're going abroad in their thousands. You mentioned the figure 3,265, and they come back bleeding through airports. And we're standing over that. And we're excluding them from any follow-up treatment. And yes, we should cringe. I think we should collectively cringe that it has taken us this time and this much effort from vulnerable women who've had the courage in the most appalling circumstances to stand up, and also our colleagues, Deputy Claire Daly, Deputy Smith, and all the other people who have tried to raise Mick Wallace. If I mention one, I might forget somebody else, but all of the deputies that have brought and attempted to bring bills before this stall to deal with the matter in a humane way. It is time to treat this society as a secular society. And ironically, for those that are totally against abortion, and I fully respect their opinion, the best way to reduce the rate of abortion is to look at those countries which have a liberal regime and they have a very low rate of abortion. And that's the most ironic, for me, fact in all of this. I'm approaching the end of my time, so I'll complete at this point.
And Jack de Pangel.
Thank you, Laskin Corla. Firstly, Laskin Corla, I want to thank the hard work and informed research carried out by members of the chairperson of the 8th Amendment Committee over the course of 4 arduous months. It couldn't have been easy, and the burden was huge, but we are grateful that the committee members have done the groundwork to enable a constructive, respectful debate on the issue of abortion in this country. The outcome of the Citizens' Assembly and Committee proved that once armed with informed research and information and personal accounts of people's experiences, the compassionate support for the right of women to access abortion reveals itself overwhelmingly. I also believe that people are ready to engage on this issue, and I am hopeful that the majority of the public will support the repeal. There is a narrative in the media that this committee report was extreme in its liberalisation of abortion provision in this country. While I am supportive of the 8th Amendment Committee recommendations, I believe it doesn't go far enough, and I am disappointed that unrestricted abortion provision only goes to 12 weeks. I believe that legislation should provide for access to abortion after 12 weeks on broader grounds. My reason for this is that once we start introducing restrictions, inevitably someone will fall through the cracks, and term limits inevitably become political and moral barriers which end up affecting those most vulnerable. We need to acknowledge that every situation is unique and that we should support women no matter what choice they make about their bodies. For me, it's a fundamental human right for someone to enjoy bodily autonomy, but right now in this country, only men can enjoy this right. I want to remind the House that the effects of the 8th Amendment are all persuasive. The amendment is restrictive to women on a number of fronts, including access to sexual health information due to the Regulation of Information Act 1995, the issue of consent through the provision of maternity care, not to mention the fact that the amendment has accounted for one of the strictest abortion regimes in the world. The committee are strong in emphasising that all women should have equal access to improved healthcare services, including basic services such as scanning and testing, and that these be made available irrespective of geographic location or socio-economic circumstances. All these services help to inform women to make the best choice for them, and this can only be a positive step for our society. However, this will be a resources issue, and I would encourage the Government to devise a national strategy which would see improved access to reproductive services for all women and girls, including better sexual health and relationship education, family planning services, contraception and free contraception for medical card holders, perinatal hospice care, counselling and support for services, and termination of pregnancy if required, because they are all vitally important and in every part of this country. Not only have we denied women the right to healthcare in this country, we have also denied the existence of abortion. Abortion is a fact of life, and it always will be a fact of life. We just have to look at the statistics. Between January 1980 and December 2016, at least 170,000 women and girls have travelled from the Republic of Ireland to access abortion services in another country. In 2016, 3,265 women and girls gave Irish addresses to UK abortion services. A 2016 report shows that 1,642 abortion pill packages were sent to Ireland in the 3-year period between 2010 and 2012, and that was just by a single provider. And these are the facts, and we all have the stories and know stories of people and know people who have supported women onto planes to go to England to avail of services that should have been available here in this country. An interesting fact, and one that struck a chord with me, was that 70% of Irish women who seek an abortion in the UK are in a relationship, while over half of them already have children. And that's from One Day More advocacy group in the UK. And we have to accept that life is complex, and we need to face that complexity by supporting people who make difficult life choices. I would like to acknowledge the committee's comment that the state should provide specific resources so that there are social supports for carers and better facilities for people whose children have specific needs. I also believe people with disabilities should be supported so that they can lead a life of dignity and respect. It is not a fair argument to equate abortion provision and disability selective abortions, because again, each situation is unique, and I for one support women whatever choice they make. Women's bodies should not be used to address the stigma around disability. Rather, this is the job of the government to make sure that society treats all its people equally, regardless of disability, and separate debate is much needed. However, it does not belong here. Do not forget that people with disabilities are also affected by the 8th Amendment, which restricts their own rights to bodily autonomy and family planning. Ultimately, the Constitution provides no legal sense and was inserted as a political weapon at the time of the referendum. For 34 years, the 8th Amendment has been inherently ambiguous in its meaning and scope, and the courts have not been able to fully clarify its content. I want to end with a quote from the National Women's Council of Ireland, that the person who can best protect and nurture a developing life is the pregnant woman herself, not lawyers, not judges, and not even the Constitution. Thank you.
Wallace. Speech. I commend the work of the committee and the Citizens' Assembly. I was critical of the government's decision to delegate these deliberations to the Citizens' Assembly, and while I think that any government worth its salt should have taken responsibility itself for ending Ireland's cruel and degrading treatment of women, I respect the work done and the sacrifices made by members of the Citizens' Assembly and the committee. It is very important for us to understand how the committee arrived at its recommendations. What I mean by this is that if members of the House or members of the public have a conscientious objection to or are wary of the recommendations, I would urge them to try to understand the building blocks and logic of the committee's deliberations. In this respect, firstly, I want to address the issues of a threat to the life of the mother and a threat to the health of a mother. The Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act permits abortion only where there is a risk to the life of a pregnant woman. While I fundamentally opposed the introduction of this incredibly restrictive act, and still do, I think most people would agree, even if they describe themselves as pro-life, that where there is a threat to the life of a mother, then access to abortion should be permitted. It would be perverse to think otherwise. While I myself have always been in favour of access to abortion when there is a threat to the health of the woman, there are those who see the life of the fetus as being more important than the health of the woman. Obviously, I don't agree with this view, but there are others who do. However, as I said, we need to understand how the committee arrived at its recommendations. Fundamental and crucial to the decision of the committee is the timing of critical clinical decision-making in saving a woman's life. Maternity medical professionals say it is dangerous and unworkable to leave or ignore a threat to the woman's health until a clear threat to her life is identified. That transition between a threat to the health of the woman and a threat to her life can and does happen extremely quickly and can quickly become too late. Medical practice requires flexibility, and the current law does not permit flexibility. Doctors cannot adequately measure or grade risk. Medical risk, and especially medical risk during pregnancy, is just too unpredictable. It is also too personal to be divided into low or high risk. I am referring here to the doctor's definition of risk, but also, of course, to the woman's definition of risk, or indeed a father or a partner's definition of risk. Some women may have a high tolerance for risk and may even be willing to let that risk shift, and it can shift very rapidly until it is too late, from risk to her health to risk to her life. That, of course, would be her decision, and she would, of course, be free to make it. But no woman should be forced to put her life at risk. We should not define risk in the Constitution or in legislation. Surely that is self-evident. Medical risk should be considered in a clinical setting in real time by medical specialists. The crucial building block in the committee arriving specifically at its 12 weeks and without reason decision, is the issue of pregnancy as a result of rape or other sexual assault. Opinion polls indicate that the majority of Irish people do not think it is humane to force a woman to carry a pregnancy to term that is the result of rape or incest. Irish people are not that cruel. While people may accept this, they may have issues with the 12-week period and the recommendation that no reason for termination should be specified. But I would urge people to remain open-minded in terms of understanding the logic of this recommendation. The expert legal advice given at the committee established what is essentially the impossibility of legislating for rape. This essential impossibility relates to the burden of proof that would be required in such cases. The precedent of an adjudication process has already been established by the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act and would see a raped woman questioned, put on trial and forced to relive the worst experiences of her life. It is an accepted fact that rape is hugely underreported. Rape victims have incredible difficulty reporting rape to anyone, never mind to the Gardaí or to an adjudication panel to see if they are deserving of a termination. 400 silent calls were received by the Rape Crisis Centre last year. That's absolutely heartbreaking. Imagine being a victim of rape, picking up the phone and not being able to get the words out. Not a single syllable. Some people will take a long time to report their rape and others never will, for a variety of complex reasons. Rape removes power and autonomy from victims. Every single rape involves non-consensual sex and therefore involves an abuse of power. The inclusion of an adjudication process for rape cases in legislation would remove even more power from raped women. They would be judged before being allowed to access medical services. If rape is a specific basis for abortion, then someone will have to decide if this basis has been satisfied. The up to 12 weeks without reason is specifically a way to deal with this problem and to avoid re-traumatising rape victims. This is why the committee has recommended access to termination of pregnancy with no restriction as to no reason. This recommendation needs to be understood in this context. It is not the result of some big liberalising agenda. Instead, it is the act of compassion for the victims of rape. Abortion is already a reality in Ireland and has been for a very long time. We just outsourced these services to the UK. 170,000 women that we know of have travelled for abortion since the 8th Amendment was introduced. We know that in 2016 alone, there were approximately 3,000 requests for abortion pills online from Ireland.
Thank you, David.
You may not agree with abortion in certain or in any circumstances, but it is already a reality, and we owe it to women to legislate for it.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now we move on to rural independence. Deputy Michael Healy-Wright, 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Ministers, first of all, I have to admit I'm nervous this evening, and I'm never nervous about any debate or about speaking in public. But the reason I'm nervous this evening, to be honest, is because I believe passionately in what I'm going to say. Nobody can blame me for that. Nobody can hold it against me. It's just my heartfelt belief. It's the way I was brought up, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity in saying my few words in what I believe in and what my viewpoint is. I want to acknowledge a great group of people who I've had the privilege of dealing with over many years in my own county, in County Kerry. And they are, of course, people involved in the Right to Life group, pro-life campaigners, people that I've worked with, people that I've debated alongside, and we've been trying to put forward our point of view over many, many years. There's one very special person, Mary Fitzgibbon. Fitzgibbon's a lady that I admire very, very much, a person who has a great heart and is a great advocate for the unborn, a person who passionately believes in what she believes in, and I want to talk a little bit about that here this evening. I want to also compliment a report that I read, and I was very glad to read. It was a report by Peter Fitzpatrick, my own colleague, Deputy Matthew McGrath, and Senator Ronan Mullen. And I know Deputy McGrath won't mind me saying this, that I heard him saying at one stage that being on the committee where they teased out all of these issues, that he found it one of the most trying and difficult periods in his political life. And again, nobody can blame him for his beliefs. Nobody can blame him for why it hurt him so much to hear what he heard at that committee. Nobody can, because he's entitled to his opinion. We are entitled to our opinion, as everybody else is entitled to their opinion. And I respect that. But what I want to talk for here tonight is I want to talk about the unborn children of the past, the present and the future. There are all types of solutions out there, and there are all types of ways of dealing with problems. I received a text a while ago, a private text, from a very close friend of mine, and a private man, very respectable worker. And this is what he said, and I couldn't read it out, all of that. He gave me permission. And what he said was, Michael, he said, food for thought for the future. I'm talking about people, parents, who might not be able to deal with their own children if they have them. And he said, Michael, food for thought for the future. My sister and myself were adopted in 1981 and 1983, and we had the best in life. They had a great life, and I know the two of them, and they had a great life. We had all what is good. There is solutions out there for all. My sister found her mother, I didn't yet. And you can say this wherever you want, and I have no problem in talking about it to anybody. That's a person of courage, a private person who just wanted to send me that message before speaking here in the Dáil tonight, to say, well, I was a child whose parents weren't maybe able to deal with the situation, but I ended up having a great life. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is the opportunity of life. You can call me whatever you like, but I believe that from the moment of conception, I believe that that person is a baby, is a child to be protected. In the same way we'd protect a child outside in the street tonight in a pram if we thought something was going to happen to that child. I just don't agree with abortion. I just don't think it's right. And nothing will ever change me from that point of view. I've given an awful lot of time over the years debating this, and I knew that eventually we'd come to the stage where we are now. I didn't know that I was going to be inside this house. I didn't know that it was going to be, my father was going to be here, or that there might be no Healy Ray here. But I feel privileged that I'm able to say my own, I'm able to speak from the heart about what I believe in, and I'll try in the best way I can, and I feel inadequate. That I mightn't be the best at explaining myself, but I'll try to explain why I am the way I am. I think that Ireland has progressed. We've seen what has happened and the awfulness of the Kerry babies. We debated that earlier on today. Nobody wants an Ireland like that. Nobody wants an Ireland where a young lady becomes pregnant and it's as if there was something wrong with her because she became pregnant. That's a total abomination to me. What happened to young girls in the past where they were locked into mental institutions, which there were, like we all know this. There was 12 and 1,300 people in mental institutions, and you know, there mightn't have been 50 of them that actually had a mental health problem. They were perfectly sound, sensible people, but an awful lot of them were young girls who became pregnant, and it was a case of shunning them away. But that's not the Ireland of today. If a person becomes pregnant today, there are services there, there's backup, there's support, there's family support, there's no shame in being pregnant. And if you're married or not, that doesn't matter a goddamn to anybody. And nobody is judging anybody like that or like it was in the past. That was a horrible time. What happened to Joanna Hayes and to other young girls who had to have their babies in private and who actually died while giving birth to their children, and the child died. Those were awful, dark, horrible. It was described, I think it was John Healy described it as the valley of the squinting windows. I mean, we're gone from that, and thanks be to God we're gone from that. But we're at a stage now where if a person becomes pregnant, if they want to have the child, all the supports are there. If they can't see their own way to keeping the child, there are so many parents and young people in this country who would give anything. They'd give the last euro they have in their pocket to have a child of their own. They can't have a baby because of one reason or the other, and they'd love to bring a person like my friend that's in me that text. They had the best of adoptive parents, highly respectable working people who gave them a great start in life. And if I thought, and I really mean this, if I thought because of my viewpoint that it would turn people against me and cost me the seat and the right to be here, I'd gladly lose it. Because the same as other politicians believe in what you believe in, and I mean this in the nicest way, you're 100% entitled to your view, but I'm entitled to my view. And I believe that a politician that won't stand for something will fall for everything. And I believe in what I believe in, and if tonight was to be my last night inside here saying these words, I mean it from the bottom of my heart that I want to stand up for the unborn children of the future. Because who am I to deny them the right to life? Who am I to deny them the opportunity that I had to come into the world and lead a life and do everything to the best of your ability? And the way that the whole recommendations came forward from the committee, I really think it's so wrong, because if you go back on the evidence that was given, and I studied it greatly, and at the time I was very sorry, and I apologise, I couldn't attend because I was chairing another committee, as Deputy McGrath knows, at the exact same time as that committee was meeting, and I wasn't able to attend those meetings. But I mean, the evidence that was given, we have to be fair about it. And it's the same as the Kerry babies case and the tribunal that was had at that time. When people will look back at that committee, they will have to admit that it was weighted one way and not the other way. And that's the truth. And I again want to compliment Deputy Matty McGrath, Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick, and Deputy Ronan Mullen for, Senator Ronan Mullen, for the sterling work that they did, because they were up against it. They were unfairly outweighed, and the evidence that was being given was very biased in my humble opinion. And I mean, if we go back, people voted for the 8th Amendment in huge numbers. It has saved many lives. It could be 100,000 lives. It could be 50,000. It could be 5,000 saved by the 8th Amendment. It means that there are thousands of people who are living in this world today, who are walking the streets today, thanks to that amendment. And then we're talking about repealing it. In this House, we can't deny that the 8th Amendment has saved lives. Yet, the Citizens' Assembly and the Oireachtas Committee didn't so much as hear from one person representing those lives who know that their child is alive today because of the 8th Amendment. How can this be fair? How can this be democratic? How can this be in the best interest of the people? And if we gloss over such an incredible story, because there are people alive today because of that amendment, and they've been given the right to life because of that amendment. Buried beneath all the spin against the 8th Amendment is something very positive, a story of hope against the odds. There has been a very deliberate attempt to look the other way, to pretend that no good has come from the 8th Amendment, to keep referring to it as controversial, as though it is no good, and never talk about it in a positive way. The 8th Amendment is an excellent lesson on how we can debate things today. The lesson is we don't debate things at all. Too many people in this House and in the media simply attack what they don't like. Everybody in politics and the media knows that the pro-life side has been largely shut out from the process, and that has been the fact. Only for we being fortunate enough to have a number of strong representatives who I've named already in the committee. If you took those 3 people out of it, it would be a completely weighted on one side debate. There would have actually been no debate, only for those senators and those deputies. There are a lot of stories today I have become familiar with in recent times from talking to people about this issue. I think about the story of one woman who has spoken out how she contemplated abortion only to change her mind. She talks about how grateful she is for the 8th Amendment. She says, the time it took me to book an abortion and get ready to travel to England was the time I needed to change my mind. These are very powerful stories. That's a child, that's a human being, that's an adult today. At present, some are pretending that when we talk about introducing abortion, it's not really going to end the life of many babies, and specifically babies with disabilities. We hear stories and sad statistics about all the babies aborted in countries like England or other countries like Denmark, simply for having a disability. They are truly shocking stories. The reason over 90% of babies in these countries are aborted is for having Down syndrome. We have to really think about that. I've had the privilege in my lifetime of befriending children of friends and neighbours of mine who have Down syndrome. And they're a joy and it's a pleasure to know them. And their own ways, their friendly personalities, and the contribution that they make to life. If we go down this road, are we going to have a situation in the future that people will play God with these people's lives, and that it will be a case of, well, if a person is imperfect, they're not going to be born? I don't agree with that. I believe that there's only one God, and he's not here inside in this chamber, and it's the right of these people to be born as good as anybody else. And if you're not perfect, and if you're inside in the womb, you have the same right to come into this world as the person who is perfect. And I passionately believe that. And sometimes, and I have specific people in my head, but we always say, Chairman, that we're not supposed to name people, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, but we've had what we'll call high-profile people in this country who have severe disabilities. And a lot of you will know the young people I'm talking about. And they've played a massive contribution, not only in their parishes, in their counties, but in this country. They've gone on national television, they've told their stories. And they're people without limbs, they're people that mightn't look the same as any one of us. Some person could say they're not as good as us. What I'd say is they might be 1,000,000 times better than us. But at the same time, if abortion was freely and readily available in this country, they mightn't have had the right to come into this world, because they might have been taken out of it before they got the opportunity to be born. I don't agree with that. I could never vote for that. I could never support it. And who am I to come along and say, well, if you're not perfect, you don't have the right to come into this world? I just think it's so wrong. I want to quote a couple of the recommendations by the Minority Report, the joint assessment, again by Deputy Fitzpatrick, Deputy McGrath and Senator Ronan Mullen, where they said, we reject with particular emphasis any attempt to provide for abortion on the particular grounds of disability. We believe that the disability ground for abortion, so prevalent in the Western world, makes a mockery of nations' aspirations to champion the rights of people with disabilities. Although Ireland has some way to travel in championing the rights of persons with disabilities, it can be said that Article 4033.3 in some way also has been a shining light. Think about what we're doing. In this chamber, we have a minister with the responsibility of people with disabilities, Deputy McGrath, a person who I'm great friends with. I admire him very much, an excellent minister. So we appoint a minister with responsibility for people with disabilities. And at the same time, what we're actually proposing here could actively discriminate and deny people with disabilities the right to even be born It's a complete and absolute contradiction. It doesn't make sense. It can never make sense. And if I'm saying anything wrong, or if I'm offending anybody in what I'm saying, I'm sorry. But it's what I believe in my heart and in my soul. And if I want honest enough to stand up here tonight and say what I'm saying, I shouldn't be inside here at all. I should never be elected if I wouldn't come in here tonight and tell the truth. I shouldn't be here. And the only reason I'm saying what I'm saying is because I believe in it. And if I see something wrong, I'll say it out straight. And I won't mince my words. Again, I want to quote from the recommendation, where they say, "We recommend the retention of the 8th Amendment on the grounds that it protects both mother and unborn child, does not endanger top quality medical care for women and unborn children in pregnancy, and is consistent with the best standards in the protection of human rights and human dignity." So go back to where we're coming from. I actually believe that we don't need to repeal the 8th. I believe that the status quo is acceptable. I believe in protecting the mother. I believe in protecting the child. I think that if we study the values of Ireland going back over the years, and we've made mistakes, as I've already highlighted. The state has made mistakes. I quoted the Kerry babies. We all know the horrible events that took part in our institutions of the state, the Magdalen laundries, etc. And we know the mistakes that we've made in the past. But I think that Ireland, at the same time, is a special place. I think that the Church in Ireland has done great things. We can be critical and say they've done things wrong, and that has to be recognised. But at the same time, we have to admit and acknowledge that our Church has done great things in the past. And I believe that Ireland is special, and I don't want to see us to go down the road of England, of America, of other countries in Europe, where human life can be so disregarded, and that people don't value the human life, and that we don't value babies. I just don't agree with that. When I was a young councillor, and I've no denying in the world in this, and when I knew that abortion was going to be an issue both at council level, and my father was here, and I wanted to understand what abortion was all about. And I studied exactly what an abortion was. And when I saw it, and when I looked at it, and it horrified me, it made me sick, and I'm tough. It takes a lot to rattle me. And anybody that really knows me knows I'm not in my comfort zone tonight talking, because if I was talking about bridges or talking about roads, I'd be fighting and I'd be in my game and I'd be myself. I'm not myself, because I'm outside of my comfort zone in talking about this, because I'm so nervous about it, because I feel inadequate. But what I'm saying is that when I studied what an abortion was, and when I saw what it was, and when the enormity of it hit me, I thought, well, if I'll ever have a say in this, I'll always stand up for the life of the unborn child, because it's what I believe in. It's the way I was brought up. I know that God be good to him. If my father was here, if Danny's father was here, I know exactly what he'd be saying.
Thank you, Deb.
He'd be standing up for the right of the unborn child, because he was like us. He was an ordinary person who believed and cherished life. I have my own children.
Thank you, Deputy.
In the future, just 1 second, Chairman, please.
Well, now you can
just 2 seconds. People that will have grandchildren, I have nieces and nephews. I could never imagine a situation where a person wouldn't want to have those people. They're the future. They'll be there when we won't be here. And I want to ensure that that will continue into the years ahead. Thank you. And thank you. And I'm sorry for going over my time. I'm very sorry. I apologise.
We will forgive you on this occasion. Now, Social Democrats, Green Party. Are you sharing time with the Green Party?
Healy.
Not the Green Party. Just
15 and 5.
Thank you, Deputy Moore.
Just first of all, I had the privilege of being one of the members of the 8th Amendment Committee, and I've got to pay a compliment to the members of that committee, and particularly the chairperson of the committee, who I've got to say I think has gained a great deal of respect, and I think people see her as somebody with a great deal of patience and professionalism. I think we spent a solid 3 months in the public sessions listening to evidence. It obviously was a two-stage process, and the first phase, the Citizens' Assembly, had lots of people on either side of the debate. There's a huge amount of material that's available that people can read and listen to as a consequence of that process. The 33 people, I want to challenge something that's been said about the process. We had 33 witnesses. We had 2 witnesses from the World Health Organization. We had 2 representatives from the GPs Association. We had a retired Supreme Court judge. We had a senior counsel who had a direct experience with the X case. We had the obstetrician who wrote the report into the death of Savita Halappanavar. We had the masters of the 3 biggest maternity hospitals in Ireland. We had the chairman of the Irish Obstetrician and Gynaecologist Association. We had a representative from the HSE. We had people from a scientific background, we had academics, and we had people from an administrative background. Now, I think it's pretty balanced. I think it's the kind of people you would write the list to come and speak if you were listening to evidence. And that's exactly what we did. We decided we weren't going to repeat the work of the Citizens' Assembly. We were going to add to the expertise that they brought forward. Some of the kind of things that we heard in relation to the evidence from some of these people, and I'm going to refer to Dr. Peter Boylan. He said, Article 43.3 gives rise to significant difficulties for doctors practising in Ireland and has caused great harm to women, including death. The 2 outstanding examples of which I have direct experience are the death of Savita Halappanavar in 2012 and the case of Miss P, PP versus the HSE in December 2014. These are only 2 examples of cases where doctors in Ireland continue to be put in an inappropriate position of having to interpret the Constitution in the course of caring for sick women. I think that's pretty significant when you have a former master of a maternity hospital saying that. When we go into hospital and we're ill, irrespective of what it is, one of the things we do is we sign a form, we give consent to how we're treated. If we have to face a medical procedure, if we have to face an illness in our lives. But that doesn't happen when you're pregnant. You can't do that when you're pregnant. You can't sign a consent form. You have no right to consent. You have no right to health. You have a right, as we were told by Mary O'Toole, who was the counsel on the X case. The Supreme Court has made a decision that the only and has the firm view that the right you have is an equal right to life. You do not have a right to health. And indeed, I addressed that issue to William Binchy, who was very much part of the 1983 process and came in front of the committee. And I'm very pleased he came in front of the committee. Others didn't. And I asked him about the right to health. And I asked him, was health a fundamental right? And he said it was. But you see, it can't be a fundamental right except when you're pregnant. Women are not, and I've said this at the committee, women are not something separate. Women are, wives, their partners, their sisters, their daughters, their mothers. These are the people we're talking about. Essentially, what he said was a major difficulty with the Act is that it is entirely the responsibility of doctors to determine how close to death or how sick a woman must be before legal termination can be performed. The woman herself has no input into the decision. I mean, that's pretty profound stuff. And I think that that is a really serious, serious impediment that was addressed at the committee, and people listened, and I think there was a very good attendance and a very respectful attendance in the main. I think it's just another thing I would want to quote from what he said was, however, it is not well understood that the same, it is equally well documented that countries with liberal laws and easy access to contraception have lower rates of abortion than those with restrictive laws. So if we want to reduce the number of crisis pregnancies, we've got to take up the issues that were addressed in the report in relation to contraception and reproductive rights. If Ireland was to enact legislation in line essentially with the EU consensus, including termination without restriction up to 10 weeks, our laws would be among some of the most restrictive in Europe. And he did say, without access to abortion in the UK, it is inevitable that Ireland would have an epidemic of illegal abortions and a massive increase in maternal mortality. So our proximity to the UK is a significant issue. When you deal with the issues, for example, like rape, we heard from Tom O'Malley, who is very expert in this area, and he told us that a central criminal court was, it's 865 days, or almost 2.5 years, is the kind of duration that it takes to actually prosecute a rape case. So look at the 12 weeks was decided on in that particular aspect from the point of view of not not interrogating or putting a woman through another process after she has experienced a rape, but it's completely impractical to deal with rape without looking at how you practically deal with it. And it's part of the reason why that particular 12 weeks, I will say, of why the reason why 12 weeks was decided on in relation to one of those areas that the Citizens' Assembly had brought forward. We listened to Veronica O'Kane, who's a professor and an expert in mental health services. And she told us that the brain controls the body, so that while one may feel sad in one's heart or anxiety in one's gut, this is being directed from the brain. Feeling emotionally distressed and highly anxious happens in one's body and leads to medical disease. The diagnosis between the body, the dialogue between the body and the emotional brain is never stronger than during pregnancy. She went on to say, pregnancy is associated with increased anxiety and depressive symptoms, and is the highest risk period for women, for a woman in a woman's life for depression. So she was making the connection between the body and the mind in relation to the issue of suicide and mental health and depression. They were the kind of things that we listened to. And there were so many, I could pick out so many that were really important pieces of information. I can't say that I went along any day that I didn't come out knowing something more than when I went in. And I think that that would have been the case with the vast majority of people who attended the committee. I believe that there is the idea of anything other than a straightforward repeal would be a complete mistake and a complete abdication. As was said by, I think, Billy Kelleher earlier, we all only have one vote in this when it comes to a referendum. But I think the people in Ireland deserve a referendum. I one of the few people that sat on that committee that actually had an opportunity to vote in 1983. As it happened, and I've made it very clear, as it happened, I voted not to include the 8th Amendment in the Constitution. I thought it was a mistake then. I still believe it was a mistake. But I do think we have moved on. I think we have the ability to take the responsibility that this Dáil should take in implementing the legislation should the amendment, and I hope it will be carried. I think we accept the all-party report. I voted for things that went beyond the report, but we accept the report. But I think that I'm really concerned about some of the things I've heard in recent days about the prospect of deviating from a straightforward repeal. That was something that was interrogated very, in some considerable detail, and I think that is most definitely the way it should be proceeded with. We hear things like, for example, what the Irish abortion rate is. We don't know what the Irish abortion rate is. We know there are women who will give addresses, the Irish addresses in the UK. Those addresses won't be from one part of Ireland. They are from every city, from every town, from every village, from every rural area. It's right across this country. You can be guaranteed that that is the case. It was very interesting to hear the academic evidence from some of the people that came in front of us about who and what age cohorts, in relation to women who were availing of abortion in the UK. And one thing that is very self-evident is the number of women that are now using the pills to procure an abortion, and doing so without medical supervision, incredibly dangerous, and may well lead to very significant health issues, not just at that point, but maybe in the future, by virtue of the fact that there isn't the kind of medical oversight that is required. And the one thing that we can't have is that people fear going to seek medical assistance in situations where we have a law that potentially, it hasn't been used, but potentially could criminalise both a woman and a doctor up to 14 years in prison. And I think there was very strong support for decriminalisation, and I think we put some very useful things into the report in relation to how that might be achieved. I think this is going to be a difficult campaign. I hope that I hope that we will have a referendum, if not late May, early June. I hope it will be straightforward to repeal. I think that will encourage more people to get out on one side or the other. I respect the fact that people come from different viewpoints, different opinions, and I think that the tone has been set, I think, by the Citizens' Assembly. It has been set by the committee, and I think it's been set in here tonight as well. And I hope that that lead will be something that will carry out into civil society groups and out into the wider public. But one thing I think that really is important is that we do need to bring the information that we got. We need to bring that information into a much wider forum. That the responsibility for that are from the media, from the political parties and parliamentarians, and from civil society groups, who I think are going to be the main drivers in this particular campaign. As I say, I think anything other than straightforward repeal would be a monumental mistake, and I hope that that will be a decision that we will see sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Deputy Murphy. Deputy Healy.
Cathaoirleach, welcome the opportunity to speak on this important issue. And firstly, I want to confirm my support for the holding of a referendum, my support for the recommendations of the Joint Committee of the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, and to confirm my support for the repealing the 8th Amendment. I wish to thank members of the Citizens' Assembly, the Joint Committee, and all those who have made submissions for the service they have done in dealing with this issue in a thorough, honest and sincere way. I acknowledge that this is a difficult, sensitive and emotive issue for many people, and the reasons are not hard to understand. intense ethical, religious, social, political and intimate personal issues coincide. But Irish abortion exists. It is a reality, even though it takes place in other jurisdictions for those who can afford it, and more recently by way of the abortion pill. It exists in a totally uncontrolled and potentially harmful way. It must be dealt with, in my view, urgently and in a compassionate and understanding way. We cannot continue a situation where women's lives are at risk and where the medical profession is unclear about the legal position. We must protect the health and safety of Irish women, and I am satisfied that this requires the repeal of the 8th Amendment and requires enshrining the Joint Committee's recommendations in legislation. It is my view that there is a significant middle ground, a majority of the public in favour of repealing the 8th Amendment and in favour of the recommendations of the Joint Committee. In this country, the debate around termination has been characterised by polarising arguments and a lack of respect for opposing positions. I want to say that I respect and understand the opposing views. The 8th Amendment was inserted in the Constitution following a referendum in 1983, 35 years ago. A new generation of Irish women and men must now be allowed to have their say on the 8th Amendment, as they are the very ones whom it will affect on a most personal level. In 1983, I publicly opposed and voted against the 8th Amendment. I did so because I believed then, as I do now, that it would have seriously detrimental effects on the well-being, health and indeed lives of women, and that it would give rise to widespread uncertainty and confusion in legal and medical terms. Sadly, that is exactly what happened. We've had numerous referendums, Irish and European court cases, and indeed, sadly, deaths of women. I was a member of the Oireachtas Committee chaired by former Deputy Jerry Buttimer, which dealt with the X case and the question of suicide. Out of the deliberations of that committee, Minister White produced the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Bill. I put down a number of amendments to the bill to provide for terminations in cases of fatal fetal abnormality, inevitable miscarriage, rape, incest, the criminalisation of women and the 14-year term of imprisonment. The government defeated those amendments, claiming that they were unconstitutional. I supported that bill, though it was limited and restrictive, but it did represent some improvement on the previous position regarding suicide. I welcome the recommendations of the Joint Committee generally and particularly as they deal with the various issues which I have just mentioned. I specifically welcome the Joint Committee recommendation 211, which reads that the Committee is of the view that no differentiation should be made between the life and the health of the woman. This is consistent with the evidence from medical experts made available to the Committee regarding the difficulty medical professionals have in defining where a threat to health becomes a threat to life. I also support the recommendation 231, which recommends that it shall be lawful to terminate a pregnancy without gestational limit where fetal abnormality is likely to result in the death before or shortly after birth. Currently, Cathaoirleach, thousands of women are taking abortion pills purchased online without medical supervision. It is urgent that a situation be put in place in which a woman can consult a doctor in these circumstances. I therefore welcome the recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly and the Joint Committee that a termination without stated reason should be permitted up to 12 weeks. Cathaoirleach, I hope that we can have in the next few months a constructive and a respectful debate on this issue. Margaret.
Thank you, Deputy Healy. Now we'll move on to members of the committee. Deputy Hildegard Naughton, Deputy Anne Robertson, Deputy Louise O'Reilly. Deputy Naughton, you're first.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. As a member of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment, I want to concentrate today on my own journey towards the position I took. I would point out that in terms of the approach of the committee, that while we could build on the work of the Citizens' Assembly, we regarded this as an evidence-gathering stage, and we brought our own judgments to bear on the issues, having listened to the experts. It's fair also to say that for many of us this was a huge learning exercise, and it allowed us to make informed decisions on what is a most divisive and difficult issue. I consider myself pro-life. I would greatly prefer if no woman ever had to seek an abortion. However, I came to the committee with an open mind. I was willing to listen to the experts and make an evidence-based decision. I think we'd all agree that we're here in the Oireachtas to make the best decisions for citizens based on expert evidence and not on our own preconceived ideas. I was conscious of issues around rape, incest and fatal fetal abnormality and the availability of termination of pregnancy in such cases. That is as far as my thinking went prior to being on the committee. I have one caveat in relation to the final report of the committee. I did not vote to allow abortion on health grounds, and while I appreciate the reasoning behind the position the majority took, I am of the view that decriminalising the termination of pregnancy is sufficient. It will, in my view, give enough scope to clinicians to make whatever good faith decisions they need to make to protect the lives of women in Ireland. The ancillary recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly and the All-Party Oireachtas Committee are as important as the issue itself. For example, improved sex education, access to contraception, to obstetric and maternity care, counselling and bereavement support services are equally important. Ireland has been a cold house for victims of sexual violence since the foundation of the state. And I don't intend to go back over the high-profile cases of where the state failed vulnerable men, women and children, but I would be failing in my duty if I did not mention Joanne Hayes. I'm glad to see that the Taoiseach has apologised to Joanne on behalf of the state. No apology or monetary recompense could ever be enough to atone for what was done to her. Let's be clear here, she wasn't believed because she was a woman. There was absolutely no evidence to back up the preposterous accusations that were made, yet she was mentally tortured by organs of this state. Reverting to the evidence of our committee, the evidence we heard, particularly from Professor Tom O'Malley SC, was conclusive. It would be practically impossible to legislate for cases of rape or incest. In circumstances where we are talking about termination of pregnancy, legislating for such instances would require some form of proof of rape. Obviously, waiting for a conviction would be practically impossible. Some women never feel able to report a rape for understandable reasons. There is also the question of re-traumatising a woman in circumstances where she has already been raped and is now pregnant as a result. There is also the availability of the abortion pill. If you do a simple Google search for the abortion pill, the first few results will give you the website of the UK company where such medicines can be bought with ease. The latest figures estimate that up to 1,800 women are using the abortion pill every year in Ireland. They are illegal here, they are taken unsupervised and are dangerous without medical supervision. In the absence of shutting down the internet, we will never be able to stop women in crisis pregnancies, women who are desperate, alone and afraid from taking them. You cannot have a Garda at every ferry and airport in Ireland searching for them. Are we really suggesting a return to some kind of contraception train scenario? If we do nothing, some woman in the not too distant future will rupture her uterus and die. It has happened elsewhere and it will happen here. I wish to be categorical here. No matter what this House or the people decide, and ultimately it will be the people who will decide, the abortion pill will still be available and it will continue to be used. Let us not close our eyes to that fact. So, do we do the usual Irish thing and ignore it and pretend it goes away, or do we do the courageous thing and actually deal with it by taking the only practical option? Legalise and regulate the abortion pill up to the medically recommended limit of 12 weeks. I fully accept that there are differing views within this House and in the wider country. I'm perfectly accepting of those differences. I wish I could have come to a different conclusion, but the evidence simply isn't there to say that the status quo is sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I welcome the opportunity to discuss this or to talk on this here this evening. I too, like Deputy Naughton, came on a particular journey. I am of a particular pro-life view, but I entered into the committee with a very open mind. And at the outset, I'd like to thank all committee members who partook on the committee, because going into it was actually very undaunting. It was very nervous, for the simple reason being is there was two particular very strong viewpoints. And I suppose my viewpoint, I wouldn't like ever to think I could have anybody tell me what to do or control how my thinking process would be. So I wasn't engaging with either side of the discussions. So I went in there with a particular open mind that I wanted to engage and I wanted to listen. But a lot of the committee probably read between the lines very quickly as to exactly where I was in my position and gave me the space to develop and the space to listen and the space to evolve and the space to reach to conclusions and the space to be very comfortable with asking questions. Because it's not a very easy topic to have an open discussion on. It's not a very easy place to have been, where there was reporters sitting 20 to 22. There wasn't even enough space some days for reporters to report on it. And yet you were talking about something that you might never have been comfortable talking about before. And that was women's health and how women were treated and how women felt. And you were listening to their experiences. And you realised very quickly on the committee that your viewpoint, or maybe what you might have believed in, or do believe in, wasn't shared by all. And you did realise quite quickly you were in the minority. That's through no fault of my own that I was in the minority, but that's where I was. That didn't make me feel any less valued as a committee member in partaking. In actual fact, it encouraged me, due to good chairmanship of Senator Noon and also to the other colleagues that were there, that allowed me the opportunity to come in at the very end to always ask the question, when other people might have asked the awkward ones first. And that's how I did it, and that's what settled me in. And to all colleagues, I do really appreciate that opportunity. But while I was coming on that journey, and I'm just after leaving our parliamentary meeting at this moment in time, there was numbers of other people who came on that journey along with me, and they would speak to me on a regular basis when I'd be going over or back, and I would tell them how it was going week in, week out. When you have experts come before you, starting off with Justice Lafoy, and she sets the stage, and then you have the masters of the Rotunda and Holles Street come in before you, and you have the World Health Organizations. It does actually paint a particular picture. There's a picture there where you didn't hear another voice coming forward. But there was a regret halfway through it for me, and that regret was the vote. That was a serious regret, and I dissented that day on the vote. And the reason I dissented was I just hadn't heard it all, and I wanted to hear more. And I suppose, looking back on it, I was disappointed that a vote was being taken and nobody had come in to articulate what I had believed in and what was my point of view. But the vote was taken and we moved on. But regrettably from there, people then, or groups, chose not to come before the committee. And that is where then people formed the opinion that this was a biased committee, that it really hadn't much basis, that the game was up, it was over. But to me it wasn't, because that's when it really got into good discussions. Because we had various other groupings. We had the GPs before us. We had the Rape Crisis Centre in before us. We had lots of other that discussed health and in relation to education in and for us. And that to me meant an awful lot, because the people who were saying that it was unbiased, or it was a biased committee, were the first to stand up every single day and leave. They were the first people not to engage, and they were the first people to take cheap shots at other members on the committee who were willing to articulate their viewpoint. And while I say this was a very private position for me. Other people had campaigned for months and years to arrive at that day. And this was their day where they wanted to be strong and where they wanted to articulate their viewpoint. And I respected it all the way. So much so, I respected it to the very end that I attended the committee on the launch of that booklet of the committee's position. But my voting I didn't change a particular voting pattern when I voted. To me, the 12 weeks was a step too far for me. On my journey, I was getting to where I would be very comfortable, and people know that, with addressing the issues with rape and incest and fatal fetal abnormalities. And when I talk about fatal fetal abnormalities, that particular day in our committee room was a defining moment for me. When the man spoke about travelling to Belfast with his good wife, and how he wondered how he would get there, and how he wondered how he would come back, and how he wondered how he'd bring the baby back, because they could no longer live with knowing what they knew, and they wanted the choice. They wanted the choice to abort a child that had been medically told to them that was not likely to survive. That man battled for 11 years with addressing what he had to go through. And you could feel it in the room that day that he still relives that experience. He was very brave, I thought, to come before us and to share his experiences. And the reason he came before us was he doesn't want anybody ever again to go through what he had experienced. And you know what? Neither do I. I do not have the right to tell any couple that have conceived a baby in love and a child that's wanted, that they do not, when they have heard that information, that their child is not likely to survive, that I have the right to tell them, or I have the right to legislate for them, or I have the right to choose for them, that they must leave this country. How dare I? I don't have that right. That couple, that family, that baby was wanted and loved. Their decision as to how they reverend that child or bury that baby or bring that baby home from a hospital should not be either in the boot of a car, scurrying, hoping not to get caught. I can't. My conscience, and I do have a free vote, and it's a vote of conscience, I would never, ever want to put any family through that. That was one defining day for me, and I thank those people that came before us that day. I thought they were amazing. But there was tears dropped in our committee room that day. And for people looking in here this evening, think that we were just heartless, or we've come to a particular position in relation to it, or we're heartless people because I would say something like that. I'm not. I'm probably one of the most compassionate, and we all were when we were sitting down in that room listening to the stories. But to some of you ladies and gentlemen, you've heard this down through the years, and you articulated it in your position inside in committee. I have regrets from it, and as I say, I did dissent from a lot of the voting that took place, as in I voted in the negative, because I would have liked more conversation around perinatal hospice care. I would have liked more conversations in relation to aftercare for women in this country. I would like more conversations in relation to education. I actually do think that with rape and incest, while I do accept what the professor said from Galway, that we cannot legislate for it, I don't know if we can, or did we go far enough within the committee for that. I don't want to put a doubt on the committee, but I just don't know, did we go far enough to exercise that completely? Because I believe myself personally there is a lot out there looking in who would possibly sit more comfortable in relation to rape and incest as opposed to the 12 weeks the way it's been presented at this moment in time. But I will support a referendum, most definitely, when that day comes here in the House to vote for it. Because, see, I do believe in democracy, and I do believe that the people themselves will choose, because I have only one vote. And I would recommend everybody to vote, because this is a very divisive and emotive issue. And I think it should be the will of the Oireachtas to let it out to the people, to have that referendum, to have their say. I did not vote on the last one, and I would like my say on this one. Thank you all.
Louise O'Reilly.
Claire, can I just ask how much time before 8:15?
You have about, I'd say, 9 minutes.
About 9. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Well, since I'm going to have to divide my remarks into two, I wanted, if I could, to use my time to share with you an email that I received from a constituent of mine, if I can find it now. And it's really in reference to the issue of Down syndrome, and we all know that in the coming months we're going to face into a referendum campaign. And I have to say, the more we keep saying that it's going to be divisive, the more likely that it is going to be divisive. I don't believe that it necessarily has to be divisive. I think that unlike 1983, and I've spoken to my mother at length about this, because my mother campaigned against the insertion, as did my father, against the insertion of the 8th Amendment into our Constitution, and I'm very grateful for the fact that they did that. I'm very proud of them, actually, as it goes, and of course they were not alone. And when I was appointed to the committee, I know that my mother was very nervous, much and all as I am a grown woman, indeed a grandmother, my own mother, was very nervous, because she remembers what it was like in 1983. And she was worried that I would come home to find people in my front garden, or, you know, people outside my office, or not that I would be physically harmed in any way, but what amounts to, I suppose, emotional abuse is what really some of us are on the receiving end of on social media and all the rest of it. And I know that she was very concerned, and we had a discussion about it, and I said, there's no need to be worrying. It won't be like that. There's a huge wealth of information out there. We're in the position now, happily, where we can have a fact-based discussion as grown-ups and adults, and we can come to a conclusion. And I'm not sure that she's convinced, so we'll wait and see what happens. But I do think the more that we talk about this being a divisive issue, the more likely it is that this will be a divisive campaign. I think this is a settled matter for a large number of people. You know, I didn't have a vote, but I'll join with everybody else, since everybody was saying in 1983 I was 10. So you can all work that out. I didn't have a vote, but I grew up in a house where issues of reproductive rights would have been spoken about, and we would have had very open and vocal conversations when we were growing up. I remember well the Kerry babies case. I remember well the case of Anne Lovett, and I remember how upset my parents were at the idea that that young woman died on her own. And I recall, and I've said this previously, but I recall what it was on the radio, and it stuck with me because it was dark. It was dark when she died in a grotto, and her baby died, and that was awful. And to think that we now have an opportunity to ensure that that will not happen again I think we have to grasp it. And I don't think that it will necessarily be divisive, because I think that people have been reflecting on this. I think they've reflected on cases like Anova, they've reflected on the Kerry Babies case, and they've reflected on cases like Sheila Hodgers. And Sheila was a very good friend of my parents, and she died in Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, and her baby died too. And they wouldn't give her any pain relief because she was pregnant. And if I live to be 1,000, I will never forget the expression on my mum's face when she came back from visiting her, because it was absolutely horrific. So I don't think that there is a person in this state who wants to go backwards on this issue. However far forward people want to go, okay, we're all talking about journeys. If you want to go 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, or 50 stops ahead, I think we are all agreed that we have to go forward. And for me and for my party, we are still engaged in an internal discussion on this, and that will continue, and that's appropriate. But I think it really behoves all of us to take a look at the past and to take a look at what has happened since 1983, and to reflect on the society we have, the society we'd like. I think we have to think about our daughters. I think we have to think about our granddaughters, our sisters. We have to look at what the law does to them, and we have to embrace the opportunity that this will present. So when we say that it's going to be divisive, I think that's unhelpful. And also when we, put people into the mix, I think we should be able to get a full and a rounded picture. So I want to read an extract from an email I was sent by a constituent. It says, "My wife and I have a beautiful daughter who has Down syndrome, and it's important for us to let our TDs know that we have no use for the 8th Amendment, and the pro-life activists who claim to care about children like my daughter do not speak for us. There are ableist attitudes and there are ethical issues regarding prenatal screening for sure, but the 8th Amendment and its continued existence does not solve them." Now that, to me, is a very, very powerful statement. And I'm happy now to have the opportunity to share that. It was shared on social media in any event, but I'm happy to have that opportunity to share. And I would ask people, before you throw spurious claims about when Down syndrome can and can't be detected, at what stage in a pregnancy, before you start throwing that into the mix, reflect on that. We have no use for the 8th Amendment. These are parents that are speaking to us, and they are saying, don't use our daughter in your row, please. And I would say to people, don't use their daughter in your row, please, because it's not right. It's not right for us to throw spurious arguments out there. It's not right for us to try to distort the debate. And it's not right, but it is almost a guarantee of a divisive debate if we stray from the facts and if we stray from the evidence. And that's what we did at the committee. And, we spent a lot of time, and Deputy Rabbit and others have referred to it, we spent a huge amount of time considering evidence, not opinion, evidence. We heard from experts. We didn't pick people based on their views of the 8th Amendment. We picked people based on their expertise and the evidence that they could give us, not opinion. We all have opinions. Evidence is what guided us at the committee. And I want to thank, in the short time I have, and I think we will be resuming, I want to thank the members of the committee, and I want to thank the chair, but I also want to thank all of those people who gave freely of their time and their information.
Can I just ask you to call the adjournment of the
I
debate and
move the adjournment.
11 minutes left when we return. It is possible that we will return to this tonight if our next item finishes before 10:15, just to take note of that, any of you who are wishing to speak. Okay? So, sin Jarlis Rochas Motherlish and Turscall on Go Kushta on up to Lassu on Mumrocht, and we will now move on to the bill, the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2017. Shin Bella Trocht on Bora Lassu Fehe Shock Jake on Dara Kem Togal. Deputy Scanlon, you adjourned the debate, so you I think 2 minutes plus.
That's okay. That's Minister, when I spoke on this bill before Christmas, I referenced the need for a sensible approach to road safety, including the urgent need for road upgrades, such as the N4, the N17, the N16, the N15. Last Friday evening, the 12th, at 5 o'clock, I was driving through Carrick-on-Shannon. There was apparently an accident on the Boyle side of the bridge in Carrick-on-Shannon. Now, this is a national primary road. For an hour and 45 minutes, a car couldn't move. There was traffic backed, I'd say, backed up the main Dublin road and back down the Sligo road for 5 or 6 kilometres. It was just chaos, quite honestly. And you know, this is the N4 again. I think we need to start seriously looking at these roads, because lucky enough there was nobody killed. Thankfully, there was nobody killed, but it's outrageous, and this is occurring fairly often now because of the extra traffic that's on the road. I outlined the Fianna Fáil proposal to increase the number of penalty points from 3 to 5 and to increase the fines to €500 for drivers caught blood alcohol limits between 50 and 80 milligram. A number of people were angry with an aspect of my comments during the debate, and I appreciate where they're coming from. My comments were designed to be constructive, and I do believe, based on the feedback to me and my office, reflect the silent majority of people living in rural communities. Let's be absolutely clear. A drunk driver can cause immense loss and suffering, and it can never or should never be condoned. Another problem related to this is that young drivers in rural Ireland also is being ripped off by faceless insurance companies, and I think this is something that needs to be looked at as well. These people are trying to go to work, they live in rural areas, trying to go to work. They buy a car that's €1,000, they could pay €4,000 for insurance. I think it's very, very unfair, and these people should be looked after. Minister, I think if we're really serious about tackling the problems on our roads, we should be rolling out a major capital investment programme for the upgrading of our national primary and secondary roads. Sligo County Council and Rethinking County Council have been starved of money for the last number of years. And some of these, part of the problems of people being killed on the roads is the quality of the road and the standard of the road. And it's something like if you take a line from Dublin to Galway, there's more